Welcome, weary listener. You found your way to another quiet corner of the past, where the flicker of candlelight meets the rustle of wool cloaks and the slow creak of city gates long forgotten. Tonight, we invite you to drift through the winding, uneven streets of Reformation-Era Prague, a city of contrasts, of saints and spies, of poets and prisoners, where the chill of winter wasn't just in the air, it was in the eyes of the men guarding the church doors, in the empty bowls of beggars pressed against stone walls, and in the cold silence between whispered prayers. This isn't the story of kings and wars, not really. It's the story of footsteps echoing through narrow alleys, of bread loaves counted with trembling hands, of sermons that sparked revolutions, and of strange clay giants said to stir at midnight. Prague wasn't just the heart of Bohemia, it was a heart under pressure, strained by religion, by politics, by hunger, and by fear. You don't need to do anything tonight. Just breathe slowly, gently. Let your thoughts settle like the fog over the Volta River. Whether you stay awake with us or drift away into the warmth of sleep, know that you're safe here. You'll be hearing stories not to jolt or alarm, but to lull you gently into a deep rest while offering glimpses of how very strange and heavy life could be back then. Now, let us begin with the life of someone most people passed without even a glance. Chapter 1. Freezing in the shadow of the cathedral doors. Imagine yourself curled on the stone steps of St. Vitus Cathedral in the old town of Prague, sometime around the year 1583. The cold presses through the worn linen of your sleeves like icy fingers. The grand spires above you reach for the heavens, but no warmth comes from God this morning. Only the echo of boots on stone and the occasional clang of a priest's iron key. You are one of the many poor who live without coin, title, or comfort. Beggars, they call you, as if it's a chosen trade. You haven't eaten since yesterday. A crust of rye swiped from a barrel left unattended outside a tavern. Even that had the stale bite of mold, and yet you savored every crumb like a nobleman might savor roast duck. Hunger dulls the tongue but sharpens the instincts. You learned that long ago. The other beggars do not smile. Their eyes scan the streets constantly. Not for friends, but for food or someone who might give it, or worse, someone who might take what little you have. There's old Marta, the toothless woman who sleeps beneath the bakery arch and claims to have once worked for a count. There's Jacob, who lost his leg in a fire and now drags himself with a wooden plank. And there's the boy with red hair who never speaks, not even when kicked by the guards. No one knows his name. They just call him Ticho. Silence. The cathedral looms behind you, too holy for your presence. You're allowed to beg near the entrance only if you keep to the side. Never block the path of a parishioner. Never meet the eyes of a noblewoman, and absolutely never speak unless spoken to. If you forget, a sharp staff or a bucket of icy water from the sacristan reminds you quickly. Winter comes early in Prague. Frost curls at the corners of your wool blanket, stolen from a pile of laundry on the riverbank. The river itself seems to mock you, its surface sheathed in a delicate glaze of ice that you dare not trust. Sometimes you wonder if death would feel like sleep cold, yes, but quiet, softer than this life. You hear a bell. Morning mass is ending. The rich smell of incense leaks from the grand doors, followed by a handful of coins, tossed down by a merchant's wife. You scramble. So does Marta. Her fingers are fast, but yours are younger. You win 2 silver groschen. That's enough for bread and maybe a sip of warm beer if you're lucky. For a moment, your heart lifts just a bit. But then come the guards. Red cloaks, black boots, sour expressions. One of them recognizes you. Didn't I chase you from the bridge last week? He growls. You don't answer. He grabs your blanket, then your arm. The steps are for prayer, not parasites. His grip leaves bruises. The coins are gone, taken in the scuffle. Just like that, you're thrown off the steps into the slush. No apology. No explanation. Just the slap of cold against your back and the smell of wet stone. The other beggars look away. Sympathy is a luxury here. You retreat down a narrow side street where the buildings lean like old men huddling for warmth. There's an alley behind a cobbler's shop where you might rest. The rats there are fat, but not aggressive. You try to curl up again, your breath fogging in the air. Above you, a carved gargoyle stares downward with wide eyes, mouth agape. You half joke to yourself that he looks more shocked than you feel. You begin to hum quietly. A song your mother used to sing, you think. Or maybe it was someone else's mother. It doesn't matter. Memory becomes slippery when your belly is empty and your bones ache. At some point you sleep, but not deeply. Never deeply. Not with the fear of having your shoes stolen. Not with the chance that someone might mistake you for dead and toss your body into the cart that comes at dawn. This was the rhythm of their lives, steady, brutal, and unnoticed. Beneath the majesty of domes and stained glass, beneath the sermons of righteousness and the opulence of the Archbishop's Hall, there are always those forgotten by both church and crown, the invisible, the undeserving, the beggars. And yet they endured, quietly, sometimes bitterly. But they endured. Let us now leave this frozen doorway and step backward in time to the moment when a single voice in Prague would ignite not just words but war. Chapter 2. Jan Hus and the Hussite Wars. The city of Prague had always whispered with the voices of faith. But in the early years of the 15th century, those whispers began to swell. The chants of monks, the Latin verses of bishops, the murmured prayers of bakers and stonemasons all flowed through its streets like the Vltava River itself. But within this serene current, one voice rose clearer, firmer, and far less welcome. Jan Hus was not born into power or wealth. His father was a peasant. His early years were marked by hunger, not hymns. But through scholarship and a relentless thirst for knowledge, he found his way into the pulpit of Bethlehem Chapel, a modest building in the old town that soon echoed with words few dared to say aloud. When Hus spoke, it wasn't in Latin, as the priest did. He spoke in Czech, and he did not flatter kings. He questioned them. Imagine the scene. It's Sunday morning. The streets outside are still slick with dew, the stone walls cold to the touch. But the chapel is packed. Peasants, merchants, even a few skeptical nobles crowd into the narrow space. The smell of sweat and smoke clings to their coats. Jan Hus stands at the front, plain robes, no jewels, no golden cross. He opens his mouth and speaks of corruption, of bishops fattened on tithes, of indulgences sold like sausages, of Christ's poverty mocked by Rome's extravagance. He doesn't shout. He doesn't need to. His calm, steady cadence cuts deeper than fire. He speaks of a church that should serve, not rule, of scripture as truth, not papal decrees. He speaks of conscience, and in doing so, he cracks open the sky. At first, Hus had all eyes. Prague was not some quiet village. It was a city of scholars, printers, philosophers, and students eager to argue. When the writings of John Wycliffe, the English reformer, began to circulate through underground presses, Hus devoured them. He translated them. He spread them. Suddenly, the ideas were not trapped in dusty Latin volumes. They were on the tongues of cobblers, widows, and butchers. Faith, once the realm of clerics, had become a public matter. This did not go unnoticed. The Archbishop of Prague tried warnings, then threats, then excommunication, but Hus would not recant. In 1414, summoned to the Council of Constance under the promise of safe passage, he traveled south. The city was far from Prague, but he carried its hopes with him like a second skin. Imagine the cold dread of walking into a room lined with robed judges, their expressions fixed, their questions already answered. Hus stood alone, no allies, no lawyers. Just his conviction that the truth could not be burned. But the church disagreed. In July of 1415, Jan Hus was declared a heretic. His robes were torn. A paper crown was placed on his head, painted with demons. He was marched out of the chamber and tied to a stake. The fire rose. He sang hymns. And when his voice finally cracked, it wasn't fear. It was smoke. But Hus's death did not silence the movement. It lit it ablaze. Back in Prague, the people seethed. News of his execution spread like kindling in a dry forest. Anger boiled over into action. Priests loyal to Rome were dragged from their pulpits. Towns declared their loyalty not to the Pope, but to Christ alone. And then the unthinkable, the first defenestration of Prague. 2 city council members were tossed out of a window by angry Hussite radicals. They survived the fall, but Prague would not survive the consequences so easily. War followed. A strange war. A religious war. One of the first of its kind. Hussite armies formed from peasants, merchants, even women who had once stood in pews and now stood behind carts turned into shields. They sang hymns as they marched. They carved wooden crosses into their blades. Some even carried communion wafers into battle as sacred talismans. They were not trained soldiers, but they had zeal, numbers, and terrifying creativity. At the heart of their tactics was the war wagon, a mobile fortress cobbled from farm carts, iron plates, and desperation. These wagons moved in circles, spitting out arrows, rocks, and fire. Behind them stood farmers wielding pitchforks like lances. Against them came the armies of the Holy Roman Empire, polished, armored, well-fed, but not invincible. At the Battle of Vikov Hill, Jan Ziga, a one-eyed general and devout follower of Hus, led his outnumbered troops to victory. It wasn't just strategy, it was belief. Ziga believed this wasn't war, it was judgment. He lost his second eye in a later skirmish, and yet he continued to lead. Blind, yes, but somehow still seeing more clearly than the generals who opposed him. The Hussite wars dragged on for over 15 years. Prague changed, fortified, paranoid, divided. Families were torn apart by doctrine. Villages razed for hosting the wrong sermon. And still, every Sunday, people gathered in crumbling chapels to sing the same hymns Jan Hus had once sung, beneath ceilings blackened by candle smoke and hope. Eventually, compromise came. Not peace, never truly peace, but an agreement. The Compact of Basel allowed moderate Hussites to continue worship under specific rules. Rome regained some influence. Prague, though battered, endured. And yet the scars remained, not all on buildings. A city that had once been one of learning and tolerance now kept watch on its neighbors. Trust was not easily restored. Faith had proven a dangerous match, capable of lighting entire provinces on fire. The ashes were still warm. Tonight, as you drift deeper into the quiet of sleep, imagine the city then. Torchlight flickering against castle walls. The distant echo of hoofbeats. And somewhere, behind a shuttered window, a family whispers prayers not from the church's books, but from their hearts. Soft, defiant, familiar. And in the silence that follows, one might almost hear the voice of Hus still rising, calm and fearless, from the flames. The city never truly returned to the silence it had known before Hus. His teachings lingered in alleyways, in the chants of children at play, in the nervous conversations of neighbors pretending not to speak of doctrine. Even the taverns weren't safe from debate. In Prague, theology had become a street sport, and everyone had an opinion. If a man spilled his beer, he might curse the devil or the Pope in equal measure, depending on who was listening. Prague itself transformed during these wars. The city learned to anticipate sieges. Old wooden roofs were torn down and replaced with fire-resistant tiles. How could a city of scholars become a city of heretics? Diplomats sent to negotiate with the Hussites often returned with headaches and unanswered questions. The rebels didn't fit the mold. They weren't seeking a crown. But his voice lingered in every lecture hall, every courtyard, every broken stained glass window. He had spoken softly, but it echoed like thunder. They didn't claim to be prophets. They simply refused to be ruled by a church that, in their eyes, had forgotten Christ. The Hussite legacy planted a seed that would, in time, grow again. The questions Hus asked the courage to challenge, to reform. To speak would find their way into other movements, other nations. They taught their children the songs that Hus once sang, not for rebellion, but because they were beautiful and because no one could take them away. Martin Luther, a century later, would read Hus's words and pause, as if the echoes of that soft, firm voice speaking not of gold or empire, but of truth refused to fade. He once said, almost with awe, that Hus had been right. Just too early. Let us enter the city on a warm spring day, when the sun glints off tiled roofs and the Vltava flows peacefully through the heart of Bohemia. A moment of calm before yet another storm. A moment when a few angry men would gather in a castle tower, look out at their city, and make a decision that would hurl Europe into decades of chaos. Stout iron gates were installed on narrow streets to slow invaders. Radical Taborites, named after the fortified town of Tabor, demanded a total break from Rome. Arguments turned into fights, fights into executions. There were days when families changed allegiances before breakfast, just to stay safe. In the southern districts, monks abandoned their quiet routines and took up watches on the rooftops. A baker might kneel before communion one week, only to spit on the host the next, caught between loyalty and survival. It was a time when even silence was suspicious. At night, you could hear the creak of wooden wheels, Hussite war wagons rolling across cobblestone to reinforce the city that never truly slept. The people adapted. Children played games pretending to be blind generals, waving sticks like Jan Zika. The bells still rang from church towers, but fewer people stopped to listen. Faith had become complicated. The old cathedral schools fell quiet. Some chapels were converted into storerooms. A few were torched, their libraries lost in orange light. Others became safe havens for secret worship, where families gathered behind locked doors to read worn pages and whisper songs into the dark. A priest now had to ask quietly before offering communion. Was it the Roman rite or the Hussite cup? The answer could mean life or death. Imagine being a humble carpenter, asked to declare which version of Christ you believed in, with a sword at your back. Theology had stopped being theoretical. Some drew crosses on their doors in chalk, a plea for safety or perhaps a declaration of allegiance. Blind and resolute, he led from sound and instinct. Soldiers swore he could hear the wind shift around approaching cavalry. He fought not from bloodlust, but belief. When he died, his followers honored his request in a way both reverent and strange. They flayed his body, preserved his skin, and used it to make a war drum, so that even in death, he would lead them. Whether it actually happened or was simply a tale meant to inspire fear, no one is entirely certain. But the story passed from lips to ears, and even the enemy armies listened. Women took up roles long denied to them, mending armor, tending to wounded, distributing food, and, when necessary, taking up blades themselves. It was no longer strange to see a milkmaid with calloused hands and a shield strapped across her back. Survival didn't ask for permission. Zika himself became legend, while still alive. These battles weren't only physical. They were ideological, fought in pamphlets as much as on battlefields. Hussite printing presses ran hot with sermons, demands, and songs. Yes, songs. Hymns were rewritten with sharpened verses. The melody of a lullaby might carry the words of revolution. A quiet hum in a candle-lit room could be as defiant as a sword. Meanwhile, Catholic Europe watched Prague with a mixture of dread and disbelief. The wars fractured Prague into factions. Moderate Hussites, called Utraquists, argued for a middle path. You might have seen two neighbors who once shared bread now refusing to speak. And through it all, the bones of Jan Hus lay quietly in foreign soil, somewhere near Constance. In the years following the wars, Prague entered a strange phase of reflection. Foreign scholars, once drawn to Prague's great university, trickled away. Yet even in this uncertain silence, something was born. And what of the common people, the beggars? The ones whose faith was shaped not in cathedrals, but in breadlines and firelight? They endured. They watched the banners change. They whispered names in the dark. Some say the bells of Bethlehem Chapel still sound different, as if the walls remember. And now, dear listener, let us drift forward in time just a few years. The window was open. The sky was clear. The parchment was torn. And before long, bodies would fly. Chapter 3, the defenestration that started a war. There are few sounds in Prague more calming than the hum of the Vltava River on a spring morning. The water glides past Baroque facades, bridges stretch lazily across it, and pigeons shuffle over red-tiled roofs without care for the centuries unfolding below. And the war that followed would become one of the longest and bloodiest conflicts in European history. But on May 23, 1618, That tranquility was broken not by cannon fire or the clang of swords. Ferdinand II, the soon-to-be Holy Roman Emperor, was a man of cold devotion. Piety without patience. Churches were being shut down. Protestant clergy were being harassed. Priests were returning in robes heavier with gold than grace. Just frowns, sashes, and sharp words tucked into their sleeves. The kind of quiet that feels like a held breath. They marched up to the Bohemian chancellery, where two imperial governors and their secretary waited behind polished desks and forced politeness. But the conversation began to unravel quickly. Voices rose. Accusations turned into declarations. One noble reportedly stepped forward and calmly said, "You have betrayed us. You are enemies to our faith, and for that you must be judged." The cathedral bells rang louder, but not everyone was invited to listen. His mission was simple: unify the empire under one church, one truth, one path. And Prague, with its tangled roots of reform, resistance, and religious ambiguity, was proving problematic. The memory of Hus was still alive. The Hussite faith had not vanished. He tightened his grip, summoned troops, declared the rebellion illegal. It didn't matter that the governors had survived. To him, Prague had thrown the first stone, and he was ready to return fire, 30 feet or more. The drop was unforgiving. But before any prayers could be muttered or guards summoned, the two imperial governors, Jaroslav Boridov, Ratinis. But as alliances activated and swords were drawn, it became clear that Europe was about to be swallowed by something much larger than Prague's old quarrels. Cities would be razed, villages emptied, entire generations displaced, all from a single act of defiance, a moment of sudden weightlessness through an open window. And Willem Slavata of Klum, along with their secretary, Fabricius, were seized and quite literally defenestrated. The kind that doesn't sleep even when the bells have stopped ringing. The city once again buzzed with the same electricity that had pulsed during the days of Hus. And the city, like a reluctant witness, stood at the edge of history once more, new flags raised over old towers. Some said it felt like the start of something glorious. A second Reformation, a cleansing. But the glow didn't last. The Protestant estates took control of the city's administration. Armories were open. Messages were sent to sympathetic regions. Farmers were conscripted. Children saw their fathers leave and not return. The wind carried the smell of iron and ash. And slowly, methodically, Bohemia began to arm itself. Not with the hopeful, but with the displaced. According to Catholic sources, they were saved by divine intervention. Because even on the edge of catastrophe, people find a way to laugh. One story made the rounds that the governors had survived because God himself wanted them to learn humility the hard way. Another joked that it was the first time in history a politician had taken a position with such a dramatic fall in status. They called it the miracle of manure, and if you said it with the right smirk, even the soldiers cracked a grin. Angels, perhaps, or at least the soft guiding hand of God. Protestant sources, on the other hand, claimed they landed in a pile of manure. A less miraculous salvation, but perhaps more honest. Either way, they lived. Bruised, stunned, and humiliated, but very much alive. In fact, it had quietly become embedded in the Czech identity. Much like the cobblestones that paved the city's winding streets. But not everyone was pleased with that arrangement. But by something far more unusual, the thud of 3 grown men being hurled out of a castle window. This is not a metaphor. The window was real, the men were real, the fall was real. To understand how Prague arrived at this particular moment, we must revisit the tension that had simmered beneath its streets for decades. But underneath, it was something far older and far more volatile. The memory of betrayal, the weight of centuries of theological scarring. Prague had been burned by compromise before. It wasn't eager to let it happen again. By the early 17th century, Bohemia had fallen firmly under the control of the Catholic Habsburgs. The Protestant nobles of Bohemia, still clinging to their ancient rights under the Letter of Majesty and agreement, granting limited religious freedom, were beginning to feel that those promises were being unraveled. On the surface, it looked like a legal dispute, Letters sent, decrees challenged, petitions drafted. So, on that morning in May, a group of Protestant nobles assembled at Prague Castle. They were not dressed for war. No armor. No flags. The room was too quiet. What followed was, by most accounts, unnervingly calm. The nobles presented their complaints. The governors, clinging to decorum, denied any wrongdoing. And then came the window. It was not a small window, nor was it close to the ground. The room sat high above the courtyard. Out they went. Now, here's where Prague's strange sense of timing enters the tale. Miraculously, none of the men died. But the fall wasn't the end. It was the beginning. Word spread through Prague like spilled ink. First by whispers, then by shouts, then by formal declarations. Ferdinand, meanwhile, was furious. Not wounded, not surprised, furious. He viewed the incident not as a political protest, but as an act of rebellion against the divine order. Thus began the Bohemian phase of what would become the 30 Years' War. It started as a local rebellion. A spark in a single city. Germany would become the battleground. France, Spain, Sweden, and Denmark would all join at various times. And yet, the people of Prague in those first weeks did not yet know what they had unleashed. There were celebrations in the streets, marches. Soon trade slowed, prices rose. Arms dealers and mercenaries flooded into Bohemia, not with prayers, but with ledgers and demands. Even beggars found their ranks swelling. War has a habit of creating more mouths than hands. The steps of St. Vitus grew crowded again. And yet, in the midst of it all, there were jokes. But underneath the jokes was tension. The kind that builds in the bones. And so, Prague braced itself. Again. From a window, a war had begun. In the months following the defenestration, Prague began to hum with the restless rhythm of anticipation. The summer air carried the scent of smoke and new iron. The forges didn't sleep. Neither did the scribes, who worked long into the night producing letters, alliances, and battle orders. The nobles met in candle-lit chambers, brows furrowed over maps stained with wine and wax. Every corridor of power echoed with the same unspoken question: what comes next? For ordinary people, the city had taken on a strange mood. It was neither panic nor peace. Shops still opened. Bread still rose. The beer still flowed, though the tavern songs had turned a little more hushed. Everyone knew something had changed, but the full weight of it hadn't yet arrived. It was like standing beneath a sky that had forgotten how to rain. Young men vanished from the streets, called to serve militias that promised quick pay and uncertain meals. Some families sent their sons off proudly. Others quietly bribed officials to look the other way. A few painted their doors with symbols, subtle, desperate signs, meant to ward off conscription officers or enemy patrols. These symbols worked about as well as whispering at a thunderstorm. There was a strange sense of order to the chaos. The city council reorganized itself under Protestant control. Markets were taxed to fund defense. New militias patrolled bridges. Watchmen stood taller, their faces sharpened by purpose and a little fear. And yet for a time it all seemed manageable. A rebellion, yes, but a tidy one, a local affair. Something that could be reasoned out, or at least outlasted. But war has a way of trickling in at first, then drowning you when you look away. Outside the city, mercenary armies were already moving. But Ferdinand called on the Catholic League, a powerful alliance of Catholic princes determined to put Bohemia back in its place. He promised them God's blessing and, more persuasively, land. Because when kings need soldiers, they offer two things: salvation and property. The Protestant nobles, realizing they had lit a fuse, tried to build their own alliances. Appeals were sent to the German Protestant Union, to Sweden, even to the Dutch. Some responded with cautious support, others with polite silence. After all, not everyone wanted to leap into another holy war, especially one started by a window. By autumn, the armies arrived. The Battle of White Mountain, just outside Prague, was where the hopes of Bohemia met the cold mathematics of imperial force. The Protestant defenders were brave but poorly supplied and led. Their cavalry wore mismatched armor. Their cannons were old. Their soldiers, many of them farmers, had never seen real battle. The Catholic League's forces, by contrast, were polished, experienced, and motivated. They marched with discipline. They sang Latin hymns, and on November 8th, 1620, they descended on the hill overlooking the city like a thundercloud. The battle was short, 2 hours, maybe less. What followed was not a sweeping conquest, but something quieter, a slow crushing. The Protestant army scattered. Some fled into the woods, others melted into the countryside. Prague's gates, once so confident, were opened without resistance. There would be no siege, only surrender. Inside the city, the mood shifted overnight. The banners changed. The church bells rang different melodies. Old priests returned to pulpits, their vestments crisp and gleaming, as if the last 2 years had been a bad dream. But the people had not forgotten. They just kept their memories quiet. The reprisals came next. 27 Protestant leaders were arrested. Judges, writers, nobles. Men who had stood proudly in the chancellery now stood trembling in the old town square. Their trial was brief. Their sentence, final. In the early morning light of June 21st, 1621, they were led out beneath the stone tower of the old town hall. The square, usually bustling with sellers and musicians, was silent. A scaffold had been built, neat, functional, unapologetic. One by one, the men were executed. The heads of 12 were mounted on pikes and displayed from the Charles Bridge. A warning, a statement, a grim punctuation mark at the end of Bohemia's brief dream of independence. And yet, even as blood dried on the cobblestones, the war did not end. In fact, it had only just begun. The Bohemian Revolt became the first act in what would unfold into a continental tragedy. The 30 Years' War, a war that devoured villages, emptied cities, and left entire regions barely recognizable. For Bohemia, the consequences were especially harsh. The old nobility, largely Protestant and Czech-speaking, was replaced by German-speaking Catholics loyal to the emperor. Estates were seized, titles revoked, language suppressed. Checkbooks were burned, universities were restructured. Even the naming of streets and churches began to change. It wasn't just a loss of power, it was an attempt to erase a culture. The silent revenge of bureaucracy But Prague resilient, wounded and watchful survived. The beggars returned to the cathedral steps, though they now wore crucifixes around their necks more for survival than faith. The market women whispered in Czech, then apologized in German. Students still met in corners to recite verses Hus had written, quietly, always quietly. And though the heads were long removed from the bridge, their memory remained. Parents would point to the spot where they once stood and tell their children, that's where they tried to be free. The children didn't always understand, but they remembered the tone. Even now, if you walk the square on a cold morning, you might feel it, a certain hush, a slight chill. Not from the wind, but from the knowledge that beneath those stones, Prague still carries the echo of a scream cut short, of boots on wood, of ideals falling from a window and into history. Let us now step away from the battlefield and into the strange world of alchemy and obsession, where emperors feared shadows more than swords, and where Prague once became the capital of the occult. A place where gold was promised, angels were summoned, and madness wore a crown. Chapter 4. Alchemy, Gold, and the Mad Emperor. Imagine a man in a velvet robe, sitting at a desk beneath a ceiling painted with stars, surrounded by brass instruments, open scrolls, and a single flickering candle that refuses to behave. The air smells faintly of sulfur and ink. Outside, the city sleeps. But here, in this chamber high above the rest of Prague, the emperor is wide awake. He is listening, not to ministers or generals, but to whispers from another world. His name is Rudolf II, a Habsburg by blood, a king by politics, and an emperor by divine right. But he is none of those things in this moment. Tonight, in his private laboratory, he is a seeker, a man chasing truths that slip between cracks in scripture and science, trying to catch shadows with golden nets. Rudolf was not like other emperors. He did not crave parades or war. He craved knowledge, secrets, perhaps even salvation. And so he filled Prague with books, beasts, and men who claimed to speak to the invisible. In the late 1500s, under his rule, the city became something else entirely, not just a capital, but a crucible. Alchemists, philosophers, occultists, astrologers, all drawn like moths to the flickering flame of his curiosity. His castle became their sanctuary. The court of Rudolf was less a place of order and more a grand cabinet of curiosities. There were no formal balls, no organized councils. Instead, one might wander into the courtyard and see a mathematician arguing with a mystic about the nature of planetary music, or a painter sketching a map of the heavens based on a dream, or a man feeding cabbage to a lion named Sultan who wandered the halls freely and once bit a bishop's shoe clean off. This wasn't madness, not exactly, or at least not always. It was a different kind of devotion. Rudolf believed the universe was a code, a divine cipher written into the stars in bones and stones. He wanted to crack it. And so he surrounded himself with those who claimed they could. There was John Dee, the English scholar who once tried to speak with angels using polished obsidian mirrors. He came with his assistant, Edward Kelly, a man with a knack for theatrical flair, and, if rumors were to be believed, a talent for forgery. Dee kept to his instruments. Kelly kept to his potions. Together, they filled the castle with rituals and whispers. At night, they claimed the voices of heavenly beings spoke through them, revealing the language of creation. Prague raised a skeptical eyebrow, but Rudolf listened. Then came Tycho Brahe, the great Danish astronomer with a golden nose and an even brighter intellect. Brahe brought with him precision. He mapped the stars, documented celestial movements, and maintained a deer as a pet. Yes, a deer. The animal reportedly enjoyed beer and once fell down the stairs after an evening of overindulgence. Rudolf didn't seem to mind. Genius, after all, came in many forms. Brahe was eventually joined by Johannes Kepler, the quiet German mathematician whose mind saw music in the orbits of planets. While Brahe relied on observation, Kepler built theory abstract, beautiful, elegant theory. Together, they moved astronomy forward, inch by inch, from mysticism to science, though neither fully let go of the other. But Rudolf's true obsession was alchemy. He believed utterly and without irony that gold could be made. That base metals, when treated with enough care, heat, and spiritual intention, could transform. It wasn't just wealth he sought. It was purity, enlightenment, immortality. Even in a time when plague still visited cities uninvited, the idea of defeating death was more than fantasy. It was hope, so the furnaces of Prague burned day and night. In hidden rooms behind thick stone walls, men in long coats stirred mixtures that hissed and steamed. Sulfur, mercury, salt. They scribbled formulas in coded books and spoken metaphors so dense they bordered on poetry. The philosopher's stone was their goal, not just to make gold, but to cure all ills, to elevate mankind. Most of it was nonsense. But in their pursuit of nonsense, they stumbled into science, distillation, metallurgy, early chemistry, medicine, ideas. We now accept as fact once emerged from rooms filled with smoke, prayer, and the occasional scream when something exploded that wasn't supposed to. Rudolf funded it all, lavishly, recklessly. His treasury thinned. His court groaned under the weight of neglected politics. But still he searched. When his brother Matthias came to Prague and asked why imperial orders were being ignored, Rudolf reportedly responded by asking if Matthias had ever heard a star speak. The conversation didn't go well. By the early 1600s, the emperor's mind began to slip. Not into madness exactly, but into a fog of dreams and obsessions that left him unmoored from the world. He spent more time with caged birds than ambassadors. He trusted his pet monkey more than his generals. Ministers whispered that the emperor was studying the color of his own shadow, which, to be fair, he might have been. The city, once vibrant with strange genius, began to feel heavy. The alchemists stopped producing anything of value. The astrologers argued over dates and failed predictions. Even the lion, Sultan, grew old and listless. Prague's golden age of weirdness was drawing to a close. Rudolf died in 1612, alone in his castle, surrounded not by courtiers or family, but by stacks of parchment, rusting instruments, and paintings of things no one else could quite explain. His reign had left the empire politically weakened, religiously fractured, and broke. But it had also made Prague, for a short, brilliant, absurd moment, the center of European intellect and eccentricity. Even today, hidden doorways in Prague's castle walls are rumored to lead to the lost laboratories of Rudolf's alchemists. Children tell tales of secret tunnels lined with bottles that glow when you whisper your true desire. And some locals still swear that on certain moonlit nights, you can hear the hum of furnaces deep below the city, as if someone is still chasing gold. Let us now leave the court of riddles and shadows, and walk quietly into the old Jewish quarter, where another legend was born, not from royal hands, but from clay. The death of Emperor Rudolf II in 1612 did not come with fanfare or sweeping proclamations. There were no grand parades, no great mourning from the powerful courts of Europe. In truth, many of them had already written him off long before his final days. His brother Matthias took the imperial crown not out of ambition, but out of exasperation. Someone had to clean up the mess, political, financial, and mystical, that Rudolf had left behind. Rudolf's once glorious court dissolved quickly. The astrologers scattered to safer territories, whispering that the stars had warned them. The alchemists packed up their flasks, promising that they were just on the brink of discovering gold elsewhere. Kepler moved to a quieter position in Linz, leaving behind the castle's cold stones and a trail of astronomical calculations. Even Sultan the Lion, by then long gone, was replaced by stiff paintings on dusty walls, eyes frozen in noble detachment. But while Rudolf's empire faded into more orderly hands, his presence remained behind in Prague like a scent that lingers after a candle is extinguished. Citizens of the city still speak of him, not with contempt, but with that strange mixture of irritation and nostalgia one reserves for a mad uncle, who once set the kitchen on fire while trying to bake a clock. They say his ghost wanders the castle, muttering equations in languages no one recognizes. A few have claimed to see a pale figure walking the northern ramparts, stopping occasionally to scowl at the sky. Historians roll their eyes. Locals nod slowly. The line between legend and memory is thinner in Prague than elsewhere. What remained of Rudolf's great obsession, his alchemical laboratories, were slowly dismantled. Some of the tools were seized, others sold. One chamber, rumored to have been used for communicating with spirits, was bricked up entirely. Not for superstition, the workers claimed, just for safety. Of course, but even as the court returned to political normalcy, the scientific traces of his eccentricity quietly endured. The alchemists, despite their absurd claims and cryptic diagrams, had contributed more than nonsense. In their hunt for transmutation, they developed improved methods for distillation and fermentation. One apothecary discovered a compound used later in treating wounds. Another refined pigments that allowed painters to create colors previously unseen in Bohemia. The idea of the philosopher's stone was fantasy, but the tools created in its pursuit had real, sometimes accidental, value. That was the strange genius of Rudolf's reign. For every wasted coin or peculiar decree, something odd and unexpectedly useful seemed to emerge. Like how one court engineer, hired to craft perpetual motion machines, accidentally designed a gear mechanism later used in Prague's astronomical clock repairs. Or the herbalist who, while attempting to brew an elixir for eternal life, stumbled upon a pleasant-tasting liquor still enjoyed today, albeit without any promise of immortality. Even the court painters flourished. Rudolf had a weakness for the surreal. He favored portraits that disguised faces in fruits, clouds, or collections of animals. One particularly famous example, by Giuseppe Arcimboldo, depicted Rudolf himself, composed entirely of flowering vegetables. It was said he smiled at the painting more fondly than he ever did at his brother. Then there were the creatures. Rudolf's fascination with the natural world led him to assemble one of the largest menageries in Europe. He kept lions, leopards, monkeys, exotic birds, and a particularly bad-tempered camel, all housed within his private gardens. Local children would sneak near the walls, hoping to catch a glimpse. One popular tale involved a monkey who escaped, ran through the halls of the castle with a stolen compass, and was eventually captured while trying to operate an astrolabe. Whether true or not, the story endured for years, passed down like a bedtime fable. But there was something else Rudolph left behind, something less tangible than inventions or animal footprints, the belief that the universe was still mysterious. In an age where religion dominated thought and kings enforced orthodoxy, Rudolph's court had opened the door, however clumsily, to curiosity. He treated painters and mathematicians as equals. He funded projects no one else dared consider. He let thinkers fail publicly and rewarded them anyway. His madness, if that's what it was, gave permission to explore without shame. When his brother Matthias took control, that spirit dimmed. The castle grew quieter. The court grew more rigid. Questions were again asked cautiously, and only in certain languages. Science became practical. Art became conservative. And a golden age of eccentricity quietly stepped aside for the slow grind of empire. But Prague had changed. Long after the wars and invasions and religious upheavals, the city retained that peculiar atmosphere. Visitors often remarked on it, a sense that something ancient was watching. Not threatening, just observing. As if Prague remembered too much to ever fully sleep. And the locals, those who still lit candles in old stone corners or paused when walking past forgotten doorways, never quite forgot the man who believed he could talk to angels. Rudolph's legacy was not measured in victories or treaties, but in wonder. The kind that hides in library basements or flickers behind stained glass. The kind that asks odd questions at the wrong time. The kind that changes the world not by command, but by curiosity. So when you visit Prague's castle today, and the guide points toward the upper windows of the north wing, you might smile to yourself. That was where Rudolph studied the stars. That was where lions once roared during dinner. That was where the emperor once asked if shadows could carry secrets. He never found the answer, but he never stopped asking. Let us now follow another kind of legend. Less imperial, more mystical, carried not in crowns or scrolls, but in clay. The streets of the Jewish quarter hold a story still told in hushed voices. A tale of protection, fear, and the ancient art of creation. Chapter 5. Golem of Prague, the mystery behind the myth. There are cities where myths are told, and then there is Prague, a city where myths live. They wander its alleyways, cling to its chimneys, and whisper through its doorways when the streets fall silent. One such myth has walked beside the city for centuries, its heavy footsteps leaving impressions not in stone, but in memory. The legend of the golem? Not a monster, not a demon, not quite a man. The golem was something else entirely, an answer to fear. An answer shaped from earth, animated by faith, and set loose to protect a people who had few protectors of their own. To understand the golem, you must first understand the world from which it emerged. The Jewish quarter of Prague in the 16th century, known as Josefov, was not a place of comfort. It was a city within a city, walled off, cramped, often watched. The streets were narrow, the buildings pressed together like whispered secrets. The synagogues were old, their walls blackened by candle smoke, their windows cloudy from years of breath and frost. The people who lived here endured. Through laws that kept them out of guilds, through taxes that punished their very presence, through suspicions that sharpened into violence with alarming ease. And yet, it was a place of strength, of learning, of rhythm. Daily life pulsed through Josefov with the steadiness of ritual. Bread was baked before sunrise. Children studied Hebrew letters by oil lamp. Mothers lit candles with trembling fingers, whispering blessings that had survived exile and war. And above it all stood the Alt Nushul, the Old New Synagogue, Europe's oldest active synagogue, its steep gables casting a long shadow over generations. It was here, according to legend, that Rabbi Judah Loeb ben Bezalel walked with purpose. He was not a man given to fantasy. He was a scholar, a philosopher, a mystic, but always measured. He spent his days with sacred texts, his nights interpreting the patterns of creation. He believed the universe was shaped by language, that the letters of the Hebrew alphabet weren't just sounds, but forces, not metaphorically, but literally. He believed that with the right arrangement of letters, one could shape life itself. And when he looked upon his people threatened again by false accusations, blood libels, and the ever-looming fear of persecution, he did not raise an army. He turned to clay. The story says he went to the banks of the Vltava under moonlight, accompanied by 2 students. There, in the muddy quiet, they sculpted a figure from the river's edge. Not crude, not grotesque, humanoid, large, broad-shouldered, silent, a vessel. And when the form was ready, Rabbi Lowe wrote the sacred word emet truth in Hebrew on its forehead. Then he placed a parchment in its mouth, inscribed with the name of God, and it opened its eyes. The golem did not speak. It obeyed. It guarded. It patrolled the ghetto's alleys, standing silently beside doorways, watching markets, following children on their errands. Stories say it could sense danger before it arrived, that it once stopped a mob by simply appearing at the gate, its shadow stretching wide against the torchlight. That a merchant who struck a child was later found locked inside his own cellar, the latch sealed with a single muddy handprint. But the golem was not feared by those it protected. Children drew it in chalk on cobblestones. Women left pieces of bread near its usual resting place. For them, it was not a monster. It was a promise, a symbol that they were not alone. Yet, like all stories, this one bends. As the golem's strength grew, so too did its unpredictability. Some say it began to act without instruction. That it crushed a cart because its wheels squealed too loudly. That it frightened a visitor by appearing in their dreams. That it watched too closely, waited too long in the wrong places. It became a question no one dared ask. How do you stop something made to protect when it no longer knows how to rest? Rabbi Lowe, according to the most told version, recognized the danger, not from the golem itself, but from what it represented. Power unchecked, creation without restraint. So one Sabbath evening, he approached the golem while it stood near the synagogue and reached out with trembling hands. He erased the first letter from emet, changing the word from truth to met death. And the golem fell. Not violently, not with flames or thunder, just quietly. Like a statue remembering it was never meant to move. Its body, they say, was hidden in the attic of the Alt Neutral, locked away behind iron doors, guarded not by soldiers but by silence. The room is still closed today. Visitors cannot enter. Rabbis declined to comment. Some say that golem still lies there, its form asleep beneath dust and shadows. Others say it crumbled long ago, taken back by the earth it came from. But the story never left. It reappeared in books and poems and whispers during darker times, when the Jews of Prague once again faced violence. Under new regimes, new uniforms, the tale of the golem resurfaced. Not as a threat, as comfort, as memory. As a quiet reminder that once someone shaped protection from clay and words and hope. Even now, the story bends and grows. In modern Prague, small statues of the golem sit in shop windows. Children read simplified versions where the golem smiles and saves kittens. But older residents still lower their voices when speaking of the attic. Some even avoid walking too close to it at night, not from fear, from respect. Because the golem is more than a story. It's a reflection of a city that knows what it means to be vulnerable. A city that, like its people, has been reshaped by fire, faith, and time. And somewhere beneath layers of stone and silence, the earth remembers. It always does. Let us now walk deeper into that memory, through narrow corridors and candlelit rooms, to glimpse what daily life was truly like inside Prague's Jewish quarter. Not just the legends, but the laughter, the learning, and the quiet strength of a people building home amid walls, not of their choosing. The golem may be legend, but the world it was born from was anything but imaginary. The Jewish quarter of Prague, Josefov, was as real as its cracked stones and crowded rooftops, while the rest of the city basked in imperial ceremonies or wrestled with theological disputes. Life inside the ghetto unfolded with a quiet defiance, measured not by monuments, but by memory. The streets were narrow, not by choice, but by decree. Homes were stacked upon one another, windows tilted to capture whatever sliver of sun made it past the tangled rooftops. The scent of baked rye, old parchment, and candle wax hung in the air year-round. In the mornings, the soundscape was a tangle of merchants shouting in Czech, German, and Yiddish, children laughing or bickering, and the scratch of broomsticks clearing dust that never truly left. Daily life moved on a clock of its own, less imperial, more intimate. A woman might rise before dawn to prepare challah dough, her fingers twisting the braid by instinct more than thought. An old man might sit by the synagogue steps, reading by touch and rhythm, lips moving through pages worn thin by generations. Time here wasn't told in bells, but in blessings. Not in hours, but in habits. Rabbis served as both spiritual guides and community anchors. They answered questions that weren't always about God, questions about debts, about marriage disputes, about how to cure a cough using onions, or how to keep mice out of the flower bins without angering the landlord. They listened. They judged. But more often they comforted. The Alt Nishol, with its vaulted ceilings and silent rows, was not grand by imperial standards, but it was holy. Inside, the air felt older than the stone. Men prayed with worn books, rocking gently, their words soft but certain. Children learned to read here, their first Hebrew letters traced into sand or whispered like secrets into their fathers' beards. And yet, for all its rituals and warmth, Josephah remained watched. The gates to the ghetto were not ornamental. They were locked at night. Guards paced just beyond them, not to protect those inside, but to control them. Visitors came rarely, and when they did, they often stared too long or asked strange questions, as though looking for proof of something they already believed. Every so often, a new rumor would rise from beyond the gates. Accusations of theft, or worse, of blood rituals, of curses, of strange practices carried out under cover of dark. The details shifted, but the result was always the same. A spike in fear, a tightening of laws, a sudden silence falling over Josephov like winter. This is why the legend of the golem mattered. It wasn't just a tale of magic. It was a story of control, of taking fear and reshaping it into strength. A creature who could not be bribed, could not be frightened, could not be reasoned out of defending the defenseless. Whether or not he ever walked the streets, the golem gave people something to picture when the future seemed too uncertain. And perhaps most profoundly, the golem was different from most protectors in folklore. He was not a knight or a soldier or a prince in disguise. He was made of earth, common, heavy, grounded. He did not rescue people by sword or spell. He simply stood where he was needed. In many versions of the story, the golem never speaks. He listens, he obeys, he watches, but he never answers. This silence made him unnerving to outsiders and deeply familiar to those he served. After all, Josephov had long been a place where silence was survival. Even today, when walking through the quarter, you might notice certain shapes patterns etched into wood. Motifs carved above doorways that resemble the Hebrew letters said to have once graced the golem's brow. Aleph, Mem, Tafemet, the word for truth. Not as decoration, but as a quiet invocation. Scholars debate the historical roots of the story. Was there a real golem? Likely not. Was there a real Rabbi Low? Absolutely. His grave still stands in the old Jewish cemetery, covered with small stones left by visitors as tokens of respect. The stones are meant to weigh memory down, to say, I was here. I remembered. I will not let this be forgotten. The cemetery itself is a tangle of leaning tombstones, stacked generations deep, because there was simply no room to expand outward. In death, as in life, the people of Josephov made do with what they had. They layered their history like a palimpsest, each era etched over the last, but never erasing it entirely. And perhaps that's what the golem really was, not a creature of clay, but of memory. A symbol built from all the layers of resilience and fear and dignity that had accumulated over centuries. He was the impossible protector for people too often left to protect themselves. In modern Prague, where the ghetto's walls have long been dismantled, and the streets paved with newer stone, the myth of the golem still breathes. Tourists buy tiny golem figurines at souvenir stands, often unaware of the weight those small forms once carried. Cafes bear his name. Books retell his tale. Films, plays, even operas have given him shape and sound. But the older residents, the ones whose grandparents whispered bedtime stories of Rabbi Lo and his silent sentinel, tell it differently, slower, more cautiously. They don't need to exaggerate. They just need to remember. Because in a city where kings chased stars and wars began with windows, where beggars slept beside cathedrals and emperors conversed with lions, it makes perfect sense that a protector made of mud and prayer once walked its streets. And so we step now from this old tale into another quiet chamber of Prague, through the narrow alleys and candlelit homes of the Jewish quarter. Not for myth this time, but for daily life, the rhythms of the ghetto, the resilience, the humor, the sacred and the simple. A city within a city, beating with its own quiet heart. Chapter 6. A Night Inside the Jewish Quarter. As the golden haze of evening settles over Prague, the city spires catch the last of the light. Beyond the grandeur of the castle hill and the bridges that sweep across the Voltava, you find yourself drawn to a quieter corner. A neighborhood that doesn't shimmer with power, but pulses with memory. This is the Jewish quarter Josephoth, a place that endures rather than nominates. And as night descends, it begins to breathe in a different rhythm. The day's noise has softened. Market stalls have been closed and covered. The fruit seller with his cart of bruised pears has packed up, his tired donkey blinking under the weight of dusk. The fishmonger has rinsed the cobblestones clean of scales, and the baker, now finished for the day, leans against his doorframe, wiping flour from his beard with a cloth that's done the job too many times. Inside the homes, candles are being lit. You can see them flicker in the windows small, wavering flames against thick glass panes. Not fancy candelabras, just humble brass holders, sometimes old wine bottles pressed into service. The light is uneven, but comforting. It glows softly on chipped wooden tables, on hand-stitched cloth, on scrolls, half-read, and chairs worn down into shapes that fit their owners. The streets here are narrow, so narrow that a person walking on one side can reach out and touch the wall across. The buildings lean forward like they're whispering secrets to each other. There's a gentle creaking overhead, not ominous, just the sound of timber remembering how long it's been standing. Every corner turns into another passage, and every passage seems to end in a courtyard, often with a cat sitting exactly where you'd expect it, watching as if it owns the bricks beneath its paws. But this isn't a sad place. Not really. There's laughter here, though quieter than in the beer halls across town. There's music, too, though it comes in bursts. A boy practicing a violin badly. A father humming as he mends a shoe. A group of girls skipping rope and chanting in Yiddish. Until one of them stumbles and they all burst into a chorus of shushing giggles. The ghetto has its own heartbeat, and tonight it's steady. Step into one of the homes, not large, but warm. The floor is uneven and the ceiling low. The air carries the scent of lentils, onions, and the tail end of dinner. A child crouches in the corner, rearranging his collection of buttons as if they are precious coins. His sister recites a passage from the Torah aloud, struggling a little, but proud. Their mother tuts at a pot that never quite boils fast enough. Their father leans over a ledger that won't balance, muttering calculations under his breath while occasionally looking up and smiling as if none of it matters as much as this moment right here. Neighbors knock on doors without waiting to be invited in. They exchange gossip, pieces of bread, and unsolicited opinions about someone's cousin who married someone too quickly. An old man sitting near the fire interrupts the conversation to tell a joke that no one's heard in decades. Or maybe they have. But everyone laughs like it's new. The night moves like this, not in hours, but in stories. The synagogue looms gently nearby, not with arrogance, but with assurance. It's not just a place of worship, but of gathering. Its steps have felt the weight of centuries of feet. Its walls have heard every kind of prayer, from desperate bargaining to whispered thanks. And tonight, as candles glow inside, A group of men gather not for a sermon, but to argue. Lovingly, of course. About a line in a text, about a translation, about whether the moon's phase means anything at all. They'll argue until someone yawns, and then they'll all agree to disagree, as they always do. Back on the street, the night grows deeper. The guards at the ghetto gate shift positions. Their armor clinks softly in the dark. One yawns. The other watches a stray dog chase shadows. They're not cruel tonight, just bored. The danger they're meant to protect against doesn't seem to be coming, at least not right now. And still, life goes on inside the walls. In a cramped room above a tailor's shop, a young woman unrolls a letter sent from Crackle. She reads it 3 times, and then once more just to feel the paper against her skin. In the bakery, a boy sneaks a roll off the tray and eats it too fast, burning his tongue but refusing to admit it. In a small courtyard, 2 elderly women discuss dreams, as if decoding prophecy, and then, like always, agree that no dream means as much as a good night's sleep. The moon now peeks over the rooftops. Its light silvers the stone and makes puddles gleam. There's a strange peace to the quarter now, a knowing calm, the kind that doesn't come from safety, but from familiarity. These walls have seen too much to pretend danger doesn't exist, but they've also seen too much to give in to fear. And somewhere down a particularly crooked alley, someone swears they hear footsteps that aren't their own. Heavy ones. Unmistakably firm. They turn, but no one is there. Just a damp imprint where no one has walked. They say nothing. Just nod to themselves and go on. Back in the heart of the quarter, the last of the lights go out one by one. The ghetto sleeps, but lightly. As it always has, tomorrow there will be lessons to recite, shirts to stitch, candles to dip, and soup to stir. There will be new laws posted and old jokes retold. And perhaps, if the weather's right, a storyteller will pass by and pause to tell a tale of a clayman who once protected these streets, not because it's real, but because it still matters. But for now, the quarter rests. Let us step away from its quiet grace and into another corner of Prague, a place where gears turn, where legends meet machinery, and where one of the strangest and most beautiful clocks in the world ticks through its own. Centuries marking time, not just with hands and numbers, but with mystery. Chapter 7, When the Clock Struck Midnight. In the heart of Prague's old town square stands a clock that doesn't simply tell time, it tells stories. Not in the language of numbers, but of movement and mystery, of figures that turn with solemn grace and stars that revolve with celestial indifference. This is the Prague Astronomical Corps as it's known to locals. The horloge, a marvel of craftsmanship, mathematics, and myth, it has marked the passing of time for over 600 years. But to understand this clock is not just to know its gears or its golden face. It is to listen closely to the ticking of pride, the silence of betrayal, and the long shadow of genius left unguarded. The horloge was first installed in 1410, a product of late medieval ambition and imagination, at a time when Europe still swayed uneasily between superstition and science. The very idea of a clock that could not only tell the time, but also track the movement of the sun, moon, zodiac, and calendar was daring. It was, in its own quiet way, a declaration. That Prague was not only a city of stone and saints, but of intellect, of precision, of dreams made visible. The man credited with its creation was a clockmaker named Mikulus of Kadak, working alongside Jan Zindel, an astronomer and professor of mathematics at Charles University. Together, they built something that was not only functional, but beautiful. A mechanical symphony set into the southern wall of the old town hall. Its face glowed with painted constellations. Its dials spun with logic older than kings. And every hour, as if summoned by some unseen conductor, its figures would move in procession. There's the figure of death, a skeleton who rings a bell. Vanity, holding a mirror. Greed, clutching a bag of gold. The apostles, who rotate past narrow windows above, giving silent blessings. A rooster crows. The doors shut. And then time resumes quietly, as if nothing had happened. The people of Prague adored it. The clock became more than a tool. It became a presence. Tourists did not exist then, but travelers who passed through the city would gather to watch it perform. They would gasp and cheer, and in the quiet that followed, locals would always say the same thing. Our clock is the finest in Europe. And in those days, it probably was. But as the decades passed, legends began to gather around the clock like dust in a cathedral. One, more persistent than the rest, told of the clockmaker who was blinded after completing his masterpiece. They say his name was Master Hanus, not the original builder, but a later craftsman who enhanced and repaired the horloge sometime in the 15th century. According to the tale, the city councilors, fearing that Hanus might recreate a similar clock in another city, decided to ensure he never could. One night, they visited him under false pretenses. They offered him drink, conversation, praise, and then they burned out his eyes. It's a cruel story, one that speaks more fear than fact. The kind of myth that cities tell when they can't bear the thought of being ordinary. Historians argue about its truth. Some say Hanus never touched the clock. Others say he did, but long after its creation. The records are unclear. What remains is the legend, and perhaps that's what matters most in a city where stories hold more weight than signatures. The tale doesn't end with the betrayal. It continues. They say that, blinded and furious, Hanus returned to the clock. Feeling his way through the gears and levers by touch alone, he found its heart, the place where all motion begins. And there, he slipped in a small wedge, a block, a flaw. The next day, the clock stopped, and no one could fix it. Not for years. Whether this is true or not, there was indeed a long period when the horloge fell silent. The city wept for it, as though a part of its soul had gone still. And eventually, someone did fix it. But the story of Hanus lingered, a ghost among the gears. What's certain is that the horloge has endured countless indignities. Fires, neglect, war. During the Prague uprising in 1945, German forces shelled the old town square. The old town hall burned. The clock was hit. Its statues shattered. Its dials scorched. The city stood in the wreckage and people wept openly, not just for the buildings, but for the clock. For the thing that had always marked the hour, even when all else had faltered. But Prague rebuilt it. Painstakingly, faithfully. Not because they needed a clock by then. Wristwatches and radios were everywhere because they needed their clock. The one that had outlived empires. The one that had watched them grow, struggle, laugh, and change. The one that had remembered when no one else had. To stand beneath it now, as the figures emerge from their hidden chambers every hour, is to feel something ancient stir. Children still point and smile. Tourists still crowd for the spectacle, their phones raised like shields. But for the locals, it's something quieter. A nod, a pause, a reassurance. Time is passing. Yes, but the clock is still ticking. And there's a certain comfort in that. In knowing that no matter what unfolds on the streets below arguments, rainstorms, confessions, revolutions, the horloge will continue its quiet performance. Every hour, every day. Without judgment, without comment. Just movement. Just rhythm. Just time. Let us now step behind the public face of Prague's society into its palaces and manor halls, where the city's elite once danced beneath painted ceilings, hiding secrets behind powdered masks. A world of wealth and excess, built high above the alleys it rarely acknowledged. A masquerade of grandeur. And a feast unlike any other. There's something about standing in the old town square at night, when the crowds have scattered and the moonlight casts silver lines across the cobblestones, that changes how you see the horloge. By day, it's a spectacle. But by night, it becomes something else entirely, an artifact, a survivor, a witness. The bells don't ring loudly after dusk. The moving figures rest behind their shutters, waiting for the morning crowds. But the clock still ticks, quietly, patiently, and the longer you stand beneath it, the more you begin to wonder not just how it works, but why it still matters. Prague has never been a city afraid of age. Its buildings wear time the way trees wear bark. The horloge no different. Up close, the paint on its zodiac dial is faded in places. The golden hands are not perfectly straight. The wood around the figures is darkened with centuries of smoke, breath, and weather. It has been repaired, yes, but never replaced. And that's the point. The city doesn't want a new clock. It wants this one. Imperfect, persistent, familiar. It is, in many ways, a mirror of the city itself. One of the clock's lesser-known functions is its calendar plate, added by the painter Joseph Maines in the 1800s. It's a ring that displays the names of saints and the months of the year. Surrounded by pastoral scenes from Czech life harvesting, planting, resting, celebrating. A reminder that time is not just hours and minutes. It's seasons, patterns, the slow return of things that once seemed gone. When the clock strikes midnight, there is no special performance. The figures do not move. The skeleton does not ring his bell. The apostles do not nod their silent blessing. But that's fitting. Midnight is not a moment for spectacle. It's a moment for pause, for transition. One day dies. Another begins. Not with a roar, but with a click. For those who have lived in Prague their whole lives, the horloge is less an attraction and more a companion. People pass it on the way to market, to school, to funerals. A couple might pause beneath it before walking to their wedding ceremony. A soldier might glance at it before boarding a train. A mother might check it absent-mindedly while her child chases pigeons nearby. It does not demand attention. It's simply there, as it always has been. Over the years, many have tried to understand what makes it so special. Other cities have clocks. Some are even older, larger, or more mechanically complex. But the horloge is not just about engineering. It's about timing. It was built during a moment when Prague stood on the edge of change between faith and knowledge, empire and reform, myth and science. It contains all of that within it. The religious iconography, the astrological symbols, the mechanical precision. It was never just telling you what time it was. It was telling you what kind of world you were living in. And it still does. There's something humbling in that. To know that the same gears have turned through every revolution, every occupation, every celebration, every disappointment, when kings came and went, when banners changed, when radios fell silent and church bells were muffled. The clock went on. There's an old saying in Prague. The horloge does not care who rules, only what hour it is. A gentle reminder that time itself is indifferent. It offers no justice, no mercy, but also no deceit. It is the one true thing that cannot be bribed. Inside the mechanism, the gears are worn smooth, metal rubbed down by centuries of motion. Each tooth has its story. There are marks where fire once left a bit of soot. There are scratches from a clumsy repair in the 1700s. There is a section where a foreign part was inserted carefully, fully during restoration after the Second World War. The clock has been tended like a living thing. And perhaps in its own way, it is. In the archives, there are letters from caretakers across generations. Some wrote with pride, others with exhaustion. The chimes rang 5 minutes late today. Wrote one in 1892. Adjusted the weights. Hope it holds. Another, during the Nazi occupation, simply wrote no damage today. Clock still runs. So do I. And yet another, after the Prague Spring was crushed in 1968, scrolled, even now, it strikes. That's something. Those records were not published. They weren't meant for posterity. They were notes between caretakers, stewards of a thing that could not protect them, but that they felt compelled to protect anyway. Even in fiction, the horloge draws attention. Writers have given it personalities. Some describe it as watching the city with judgment. Others claim it dreams when no one is looking. Children's books tell of tiny clock spirits who keep it working when all else fails. One popular tale insists that if it ever stops for more than a day, Prague will fall into permanent sleep. A charming fiction, but given the city's love of quiet, maybe not an entirely bad one. And so each hour the performance continues. The skeleton rings his bell. Vanity admires her reflection. Greed counts his coins. The apostles nod. And the rooster crows, a little mechanically, a little proudly. Then the windows close and the world continues. People applaud, take photos, sip their coffees. But beneath all that, something deeper stirs. It's the recognition that time moves whether we notice or not. That beauty can last longer than its maker. That in a world filled with chaos, at least one thing has kept its promise. Tick by tick, hour by hour, year by year. Let us now move from this steady rhythm into the unpredictability of excess, into the palaces and ballrooms of the bohemian elite, where powdered wigs hide political games and every glittering chandelier casts shadows on secrets below. A night of velvet, wine, and masquerade awaits. Chapter 8. A Bohemian Noble's Surreal Masquerade Feast. It begins with the soft clap of hooves on stone. A carriage arriving under the veil of twilight. Lanterns sway gently on iron arms, casting elongated shadows against ivy-covered walls. A servant steps down, gloved hands open the door, and out steps a figure dressed not for travel, but for spectacle. Powdered white, robed in silk, masked in gold. Tonight is not for politics, not openly. Tonight is for elegance, for illusion, for a ritual of excess woven into the candlelit heart of bohemian mobility. The nobleman hosting this feast lives in a palace that doesn't quite advertise itself. Tucked behind an unassuming facade near Malestrana, the lesser quarter, the building expands inward like a shell hiding a pearl. From the street, it's merely handsome. But in side-ceiling murals stretch like heaven, walls gleam with imported marble, and chandeliers drip with crystal that sways at the hint of footfall. Even the servants tread lightly, as if the air here is too expensive to disturb. The guests arrive in pairs, in trios, in calculated arrivals spaced just far enough apart to ensure notice. They wear masks, some of porcelain, others of painted leather, even a few gilded with silver leaf. Cats, birds, angels, wolves. The anonymity is only half the point. Everyone knows who everyone is, of course. The masks allow them to speak without consequence, to smile without sincerity, to lie without guilt. A string quartet plays something light in French. In the far room, a harpsichord echoes faintly, but no one can recall who's playing it. Platters of roasted quail and sugared almonds pass from gloved hand to gloved hand. A sculpted ice swan drips silently in the corner, melting into a bowl of floating fruit. It's all theatrical. Even the wine is tinted with crushed violets, not for taste, but for hue. At the heart of the room is Count Radomvokus, the host. A man of impeccable grooming and famously poor memory, or so he claims whenever politics arise. He's dressed as a jester, tonight harlequin diamonds stitched in gold thread, the mask fixed in a perpetual smirk. His laughter is light and musical, but never quite reaches his eyes. He greets each guest with the same 2 kisses, regardless of whether he likes them or not. He calls everyone my dear. He remembers nothing and everything. There's Baroness Virazeta, wearing a mask shaped like a fox. She speaks only in riddles tonight. Last month, she was seen slipping coded letters into the hands of foreign envoys. This month, she declares herself bored of espionage and obsessed with astrology. She's decided that Bohemia's fate depends on the movement of Venus. People nod. Someone changes the subject. A military officer, mustache waxed into cruel perfection, holds a peach in his hand, like a globe, squeezing it slowly. He doesn't speak much. He doesn't need to. Everyone here knows what he did in Moravia. No one brings it up. Instead, they compliment his boots. Laughter flows like perfume pleasing from afar, nauseating up close. Dancers begin to form small circles, gliding between flickering candlelight and frescoed columns. The tempo never quickens. This is not a party for the young. It's a ritual repeated with the precision of a clockwork ballerina. The steps are always the same. Admire, flatter, watch, whisper, retreat. A masked priest in attendance, real or not, offers blessings with one hand and small vials of green liquid with the other. It's rumored to be a tonic from Italy, or a poison, or a love potion. He never says. Some guests take it. Others pretend to. The risk is part of the thrill. There are no windows open. The room grows warm. Fans flutter like birds in nervous hands. Powdered wigs begin to itch. Somewhere, behind a velvet curtain, A couple argues in hushed German. One of them is crying. The other's bored. At precisely the middle of the evening, the feast begins in earnest. The long dining table is revealed dripping with candlelight, edged in silver, heavy with meat, fruit, and decorative flourishes that resemble food more than they taste like it. A boar's head grins from the centerpiece. Grapes spill over polished trays like forgotten offerings. The guests sit not by rank, but by whim. A duchess next to a poet. A banker between two exiled cousins. Conversation drifts lazily across courses. Some of it real, most of it rehearsed. Someone mentions the emperor. Someone else quickly mentions the weather. There are murmurs about rising taxes, about Hungarian unrest, about Spanish ships seen too far east, but only murmurs. This is not a night for truth. A toast is offered to Bohemia, to elegance, to the masks that let us be our truest selves. Laughter follows, too loud and too long. Beneath the table, shoes brush. Fingers tap secret codes onto gloved wrists. One noble woman, far too drunk, begins to tell a story about her grandfather's duel in Vienna. She's interrupted before she can finish. The room doesn't want to hear about blood. Not tonight. As dessert is served, some kind of sugared flour floating in custard, the masks begin to slip, not literally. They stay fixed to faces, but the persona's thin. A guest slouches slightly. Another sighs too openly. The man in the eagle mask stares too long at the countess in black. The pretense wavers. Just for a moment. But then the music swells again. A servant drops a tray. The count laughs loudly, turning all heads. The moment is lost. The play resumes. For those watching from outside through keyholes or hidden galleries, it's a beautiful scene. Rich with color, movement, and elegance. But for those inside, the air grows heavy with what is not said. The weight of alliances, debts, betrayals hanging behind every toast. Because behind the masks are faces tired of smiling. Behind the silk are secrets older than this century. And beneath the tablecloth, beneath the marble floors, beneath the palace itself, is a city watching. A city that has seen masquerades before. A city that knows how quickly the dance ends when the music falters. Let us now linger here just a little longer. One more circuit around the table. One more whispered promise. One more breath before the night turns cold and the masks return to their boxes. The feast begins to soften as midnight draws near, not end. Not collapse, just soften. The musicians in the corner now play more slowly, less for the dancers and more for themselves. The candles are shorter than they were before, their wax forming quiet lakes on the silver stands. Some guests have slipped away. Others remain, not because they're still enjoying themselves, but because leaving too early suggests disapproval and leaving too late suggests desperation. The Count still circles the room like a clock hand, slower now, his laughter a little frayed at the edges. His jester's mask has gone slightly askew, revealing a pale cheek slick with sweat. He no longer remembers which guests he's greeted. He no longer cares. At one point, he raises a toast to the enduring wisdom of the peacock, which draws a few chuckles and one confused cough. In a side room behind a panel door disguised as a bookshelf, a card game is being played, and no one speaks. The only sound is the soft slap of cards and the occasional sharp intake of breath. The stakes are not coins, but favors owed and unnamed. One player in a dog mask leaves without collecting his winnings. He simply nods and vanishes down a back corridor. Elsewhere in the palace, a woman in a blue feathered mask stands on a balcony, watching the rooftops of Prague stretch out like a sea of sleeping dragons. The breeze lifts her hair and cools her flushed face. Below, a drunk noble is vomiting into a potted orange tree. She doesn't blink. She's seen worse. She once watched a man confess treason over pheasant stew. A servant passes her with a tray of crystal goblets. She takes one, not to drink, but to keep her hands busy. Inside the glass, she notices a hairline crack. Almost beautiful, how it catches the moonlight, almost tragic. She wonders how many things tonight are just one breath away from breaking. Back inside, the masquerade winds on. The poet, who hasn't written in 5 years but is still paid handsomely to pretend he might, recites a few verses about stars and longing. A noble woman fans herself theatrically, and declares, "She hasn't heard such beauty since the Archduke fell in love with his fencing instructor." Everyone laughs. Even the poet, though not convincingly. Behind him, a tapestry stirs slightly too much breeze for a closed window. Someone is hiding back there, eavesdropping. A bored niece? A spy? Or perhaps a guest who prefers observing to performing. In this palace, one never quite knows. Every silence feels deliberate. Every coincidence feels rehearsed. The chandeliers overhead sway just enough to make the reflections in the wine glasses dance. A man who has not spoken all evening finally speaks. His voice is too deep for the mask he wears. He asks the Count if the rumors of war in the south are true. The Count smiles, says nothing, sips, changes the subject to porcelain imports. The man nods. He expected no answer. Down the hallway, an artist stares at a bust of the emperor carved in marble. He's been commissioned to paint it for a series of state portraits. But tonight, he just squints, head tilted, eyes narrowed. He looks tired, the artist mutters. Too many battles, not enough sleep. A passing servant replies without stopping, "That's not the emperor, that's his cousin." The artist shrugs, explains the mustache. A steward walks the room with a brass bell, softly chiming it once every quarter hour. Not because anyone needs to know the time, but because the Count believes it adds structure to the chaos. A guest asks the steward what hour it is. He replies, "Past forgiveness, not quite dawn," then walks away. A trio of guests begins a waltz without music, just memory. Their steps are clumsy but elegant. They laugh quietly when they collide. One of them, a diplomat, whispers that he used to dance with the queen. The others smile, not sure if they should believe him, but deciding it doesn't matter either way. The wine runs dry, then is replaced, then runs dry again. This continues until the servants start replacing empty bottles with full ones already opened hours before. No one notices. The taste has long since dulled. The guests are no longer savoring. They are performing the idea of pleasure. The masks, though still worn, begin to feel transparent. You can see through them now, not physically, but in mood. The noblewoman with the fox mask leans too close when she speaks, as if desperate to be understood for once. The priest has stopped offering blessings and begun asking for secrets. A young count who came with two friends now sits alone, chewing the inside of his cheek and staring at the floor. One guest collapses into a chair near the hearth, sighs loudly and says, "I do hope we're not all still pretending this is a celebration." A hush falls for a moment. Then someone throws a fig at him. He ducks. The room erupts into soft, relieved laughter. The spell is broken, but not shattered. The performance continues, because that's the real art of the masquerade. Knowing it's a game and choosing to keep playing anyway. Finally, the Count raises his glass one last time. "To masks," he says, "which let us say what our faces cannot." Some cheer. Some groan. A few slip out before dessert, pretending they've been called away on urgent matters. One leaves without a coat. Another without their shoes. As the carriages rattle off into the Prague dawn, their wheels echo on the cobblestones like distant drums. The palace grows quiet. The musicians pack away their instruments. The wine stains are left for morning. The ice swan has lost its head. A servant enters the ballroom, pauses at the sight of an abandoned mask on the floor, and leaves it where it is. He's learned that some things are best left undisturbed, because even after the candles have been snuffed and the perfumes faded, the masquerade lingers, in memory, in rumor, in the quiet tension of the next invitation. And beneath it all, the city watches. Prague has seen more masks than mirrors, and it knows that sometimes the most honest thing a person can do is pretend. Let us now trade these powdered wigs and velvet cloaks for rougher cloth and louder voices. Let us step into the taverns and beer halls, where revolution brews alongside barley, and where, in the clink of mugs and murmur of dissent, a different kind of Prague reveals itself. Chapter 9. Brewing revolt in the beer halls. The chandeliers have gone out. The velvet has been folded away. Now, we follow the flickering lanterns down into Prague cellars. No gold leaf here, no harpsichords. Only thick wooden beams, low ceilings stained with smoke, and the rich, steady smell of barley and yeast. This is not where nobles entertain. This is where truth lingers at the bottom of a mug. Welcome to the beer halls of Bohemia. To understand Prague, you must understand its beer, not just the drink, but the culture wrapped around it like foam on a fresh pour. In the 16th and 17th centuries, beer was not a novelty or a luxury. It was a staple, safer than water, cheaper than wine, and more reliable than kings. Every neighborhood had its brewery. Every conversation began with a clink of ceramic steins. The taverns themselves were rough, welcoming, and often older than the laws that govern them. Low tables sat scarred with knife marks and initials. The benches wobbled. The candles guttered. But no one cared. These halls weren't about beauty. They were about familiarity, about shared silence and noisy debates, about men and women arriving cold and leaving warm, if not always happier. The innkeeper was more than a businessman. He was a mediator, a counselor, a local historian. He knew who owed whom, who argued last week, who was cheating at cards, and who was 3 drinks away from telling the truth. He pretended not to listen, but remembered everything. His word could calm a crowd or light a match. It depended on the night. One popular establishment sat near Charles Bridge, just out of sight of the city guard's usual patrol. It didn't have a name. Locals called it the cellar. If you had to ask for directions, you probably weren't invited. The floor was always slightly damp. The door creaked like it held grudges. And the ale, strong enough to encourage honesty, weak enough to prolong mistakes. This was not a place for toast to emperors. It was where farmers grumbled about taxes, where students whispered about forbidden books, where printers showed off half-finished pamphlets that would soon be burned or banned. It was where resistance didn't roar. It simmered. Evenings in the beer halls began innocently. A few friends, a few mugs, talk of weather and wheat. But slowly, steadily, the talk deepened. Someone would mention the price of salt. Someone else, the bishop's latest decree. Another would mutter something about Vienna, or about German landowners who didn't know how to pronounce the names of the people they taxed. Voices rose, arguments sparked, and just when it seemed the room might tip into violence, someone would raise a mug, bang it twice on the table, and declare, "Let's not spill the beer over fools we've never met." It usually worked. The truth is, Prague's beer halls were more than drinking spots. They were the city's lungs, its pulse, a place where information flowed faster than sermons or letters, where gossip became opinion, opinion became anger, and anger, when properly fermented, became rebellion. It was here that the seeds of the 1680 defenestration were first sown, not in the palace, but in the pubs. Quiet voices wondering aloud what might happen if someone pushed back. A farmer mentioned the old Hussite days. A merchant recalled his grandfather's tales of throwing priests out windows. Everyone laughed. But no one said it wasn't possible. When pamphlets began to circulate, small, crudely printed pages condemning imperial overreach or Catholic excess, they were read aloud in taverns. A man with clear handwriting and a steady voice could draw a silent crowd in a matter of minutes. The printers remained anonymous. The readers did not. But the room protected them. Some nights, those same voices turned toward more local issues. The corrupt grain inspector, the city guard who overstepped, the judge whose nephew never seemed to pay taxes. In a world of distant rulers and grand churches, the beer hall was where justice was reimagined one mug at a time. And it wasn't just men, women brewed, owned taverns, listened, laughed, argued. A widow named Narika ran a small establishment off Golden Lane. And though her clientele was mostly blacksmiths and stonemasons, she held her own in every debate. Once, when a young clerk accused her of serving weak beer, she dumped a bucket of hops over his head and told him, "Now you'll understand bitterness." He never returned. No one missed him. There were codes too, ways to speak without speaking. If a mug was placed upside down, it meant the conversation was over. If someone knocked 3 times, they were quoting from a banned preacher's sermon. If a candle was moved to the center of the table, it meant someone was listening who shouldn't be. And there was always someone listening. Spies weren't just in palaces, They were in aprons and tunics. They sat with their backs to the wall, sipped slowly, and reported what they heard to whatever authority paid them most recently. Sometimes they were ignored. Sometimes not. One winter night, a known informant disappeared after leaving a tavern near Viserud. No one saw anything. No one heard anything. But when the innkeeper swept the floor the next morning, he found a silver coin nailed into the wood. An old Hussite symbol. No one asked what it meant. Everyone understood. The authorities tried to shut the beer halls down, of course, or at least tame them. New taxes were placed on brewing. Curfews were set. Priests preached against tavern vice. None of it worked. You could take away their grain, but the Czechs would ferment turnips if they had to. Beer was not a habit. It was an identity. Even during sieges, when food was rationed and water was scarce, beer still flowed. It became thinner, yes. Strange tasting, sometimes. But it was there. And with it, the sense that not everything had been taken. That conversation could still be had. That community, even in its rawest form, was still intact. And in the midst of it all, Prague endured not through grand declarations, but through stubborn conversation. Through laughter after hard days. Through disagreement followed by shared loaves. Through the ritual of raising a mug not because things were good, but because they weren't, and that deserved recognition too. So, if you ever find yourself wandering Prague late at night, and you stumble upon a warm room tucked behind a low door, where the walls are dark with age and the laughter carries weight, step inside, sit quietly, order what they're having, and listen. You'll hear history repeating, not loudly, but clearly. Let us now remain in this world of whispers and look closer at the shadows hiding within the light, at how the church and confession booths, once meant for solace and salvation, became tools of surveillance and subtle control. A place where secrets were not forgiven, but passed along. As revolts go, the Bohemian resistance wasn't ignited by a single match. It brewed slowly, like the dark lagers in the cellars beneath Prague's cobbled streets, thick, patient, intentional. And by the time the rulers noticed the foam rising, the cask had already split. You see, revolutions aren't always born in courtrooms or from pamphlets fluttering in the wind. Sometimes they are born in the spaces between laughter, in the careful raising of eyebrows over ale, in the way one sentence lingers a moment too long, in a room that goes quiet not because of what was said, but because of who might have heard it. In Prague's beer halls, political discussion wasn't an act of rebellion, it was an act of routine. And that, more than any shouted slogan, was what made it dangerous. It was normalized, embedded in the daily rhythm of a people too familiar with the slow encroach of foreign decree. The rules changed often. The beer remained the same. It gave them something firm to hold. But as the years wore on and the pressures of empire tightened, the murmurings turned to murmurs no longer. Prague citizens had seen nobles falter and reformers burn. They had watched their priests shift allegiances. They had lived through defenestrations, excommunications, and forced conversions. And yet, still, they gathered in cellars to say the things they could not say above ground. Some beer halls became known not just for their ale, but for their alliances. A tavern near the stone foot of Charles Bridge was favored by Protestant reformers. One up the hill near the Strav monastery often drew Catholic officers. You'd know within moments which one you'd entered. It wasn't about the decor. It was about the silence when you walked through the door. Others were more mixed, neutral ground. A meeting of minds, or at least a collision of them. The innkeeper at one such place was said to pour with one hand and listen with the other, and never once did he spill a secret or a pint. And so the idea swirled. The legacy of Jan Hus, once only whispered, began to appear in toasts. To those who speak the truth, even if they burn for it, glasses would rise. No one would say his name, but they didn't need to. A new preacher in town speaking gently against church corruption would be discussed quietly over cheese and cured pork. He's no Hus, someone might say, but his voice carries. And someone else would nod. News of another law from Vienna would be met not with outrage, but with the kind of sigh that says, "We expected this." Then the next round would be ordered. One clever brewer began printing lines of subversive verse on his beer label's tiny scripts that circled the rim. No one outside the tavern noticed, but everyone inside knew. A poem about lions afraid of mice, a line from a banned song, a joke about the emperor's eyebrows, most of it harmless, some of it not. Eventually these acts drew attention. The authorities began sending in informants more frequently, men with clean boots and questions that came too quickly. They'd sit quietly at a corner table and listen. Sometimes they'd ask for extra mustard on their bread, an accidental giveaway. Real locals didn't eat mustard that way. Sometimes they'd forget to drink. That was the surest sign. When one such man disappeared after a night at a brewery near Rodkany, the officials came in force. They shut the place down for a week, questioned the staff, threatened worse. But no one said anything. No one had seen anything. The official report stated the man had slipped into the river. A tragic accident, it read. The innkeeper nodded solemnly. Indeed, very slippery in winter. Despite the risk, the gatherings continued. And it wasn't just rebellion for rebellion's sake. These were people holding together what they could, sharing news, sorting truth from rumor, preserving identity. Because more than beer flowed in these halls, language flowed. Czech, in particular, during a time when German had begun to dominate official documents and royal courtrooms. In the taverns, Czech was spoken freely, even poetically. Proverbs were passed along, old phrases revived. Toasts made in the mother tongue held more meaning than entire sermons in Latin. Even music played a role. Traveling fiddlers would slip songs into their sets, melodies from banned folk hymns, lines from protest poems disguised as dance tunes. A sharp-eared listener could learn a lot between verses. One evening, a fiddler from Bro played a tune. No one could name it. The room fell quiet. No clinking, no chewing, just the slow rhythm of recognition. It was said the song had been played as the Hussite banners fell at White Mountain. And yet here it was again, rising softly in a smoke-filled room beneath the floorboards of an indifferent empire. In that moment, the beer hall was no longer just a tavern. It was memory, defiance, sanctuary. And as the music ended and someone coughed and the spell broke, life went on. But not unchanged. Outside, snow began to fall. Thin flakes dusted the cobblestones, the rooftops, the barrels left by back doors. Horses shifted in their reins. Lanterns flickered. Inside, a woman refilled mugs without being asked. A man scratched a note into the wood of the table when no one was looking. A teenager collected empty plates and listened harder than anyone gave him credit for. The innkeeper watched it all, nodding to himself, because in the end, he knew the truth. You don't need swords to start a revolution. You need tables. And time, and people who are willing to sit down again and again until someone finally decides to stand. Let us now move from the open defiance of tavern talk to the hushed and careful spaces of confessionals. Places where secrets are not just shared, but sometimes ... stored. Where the walls may not talk, but they remember. Chapter 10. Spies in the confessional booth. There are places where words are meant to vanish the moment they are spoken. Rooms built for secrets. Walls that were never supposed to echo. In Prague, no such place carried more weight or more tension than the confessional booth. Inside the heavy wood latticework, you could admit to almost anything. A theft, a lie, a betrayal, a thought you hadn't spoken aloud to anyone. And in theory, it would remain there, suspended between you and the priest like dust in the sunlight. Invisible, weightless, absolved. But in Reformation-Era Prague, even holiness had cracks. Step into one of the city's older churches, St. Thomas perhaps, or St. Nicholas with its thick stone pillars and dim candlelight curling up into painted domes. The floor is cool beneath your feet. The scent of incense clings to the walls. You pass statues whose faces have been softened by time and devotion. You hear the echo of a cough, a child's footstep, a priest's murmur. Tucked along the side aisles are the confessional's wooden boxes, dark and narrow. One side for the penitent, one for the priest. A thin partition in between, thin enough for words, too thick for judgment. Or at least that was the idea. In practice, the confessional booth in Prague was rarely just a sacred space. It was a listening post. A confessional could offer forgiveness, but it could also offer information. And in a city fractured by religious strife, shifting loyalties, and frequent suspicion, information was more valuable than any indulgence. By the mid-1600s, it was no secret that some priests served more than one master. They heard the sins of bakers, blacksmiths, merchants, and sometimes they passed those sins along, not to God, but to the local magistrate, or the bishop, or a nobleman with a vested interest in keeping his city quiet. A man might come to confession troubled not by his actions, but by his silence. He may have heard something at a tavern or seen something near the city gates. He might not be confessing guilt-only uncertainty, but once spoken, those words gain weight. A woman might whisper fears about her neighbor, about a sermon she overheard, about a cousin who had started reading dangerous texts, and the priest might murmur words of comfort. He might nod gently, and later he might write down a few notes. And not all did this, of course. Many priests were true to their role, keeping secrets even at great personal risk. But others saw the booth not as a burden, but as an opportunity. Confession became currency. And currency, in Prague, always found its way to power. Sometimes, the priests were the ones watched. The crown, wary of religious dissent, placed men in pews near the confessional booths, pretending to pray while actually counting visitors. Who was confessing too often? Who never came at all? Who lingered after Mass, whispering not to God, but to each other? The pulpit became a perch for influence. A sermon might contain veiled warnings. A parable retold with unusual emphasis. Blessed are those who speak truth, even if their neighbors do not. A subtle nudge, a quiet call to attention. Some churches kept locked cabinets behind the altar, not just for communion wine or sacred linens, but for parchment, reports, lists, observations. There's a story of one priest who memorized the sins of a local merchant, each debt, each bribe, each hidden barrel of untaxed wine. He used them not to extort, but to negotiate. If you wish to keep the Lord's forgiveness, he said once, you might consider donating more generously to the poor, or to this church's roof. The roof was repaired within a month. In certain parishes, confession became a performance. The language coded, the tone careful. The booth felt less like sanctuary and more like a courtroom with no gavel. One might begin, "Bless me, Father, for I have spoken too freely." And the priest would ask, to whom and about what? Some parishioners began to alter their voices, or confess less, or turn to private prayers, whispered in cellars where God had no intermediary. The irony, of course, was that while some priests acted as informants, others risked their lives by not cooperating. There were those who hid fugitives in the crypts, who smuggled messages beneath wafers, who took concussions not to record them, but to protect them. Father Marek, a Jesuit known for his kindness and sharp memory, reportedly offered false confessions on behalf of others. When a woman feared her son had spoken carelessly, he would confess the words as if they were his own. The church questioned him. The city admired him. When he died, his funeral procession stretched for blocks. No one said why they came. They didn't have to. And the confessional booths remained quiet, heavy, permanent during times of plague. They stood empty, the churches locked, the priests afraid or absent. During times of peace, they were polished, their curtains repaired, their hours extended. During war, they became places where soldiers wept not over killing, but over surviving. In each booth, the grain of the wood holds generations of whispered fears. You can still see the wear on the kneeler, shaped by knees that bent in desperation. Some scratch initials into the wall. One booth in the Church of St. Giles still bears the faint carving of a dove. No one knows who put it there. But its wings stretch wide, as if it wanted to fly away with everything it had heard. Today, the confessionals are quieter. Tourists take pictures of them. Guides explain their structure, their history. But few mention the listening, the reporting, the slow erosion of trust. Because Prague remembers not loudly, but deeply. The churches still stand. The bells still ring. The booths still wait. Let us now peer beyond the sacred and return to the surreal. Moment when mystery and madness blurred, when a strange sickness swept through Prague, gripping its victims with visions, tremors, and night screams. A fire with no smoke. A plague not of the body but of the mind. The true danger of a whispered word is not in how it's heard, but in how it's remembered. Confession in Reformation-Era Prague was a ritual of language, and in a city where language could heal or wound, each word mattered more than the one before it. The booths may have been dark, the air stale with incense and candle smoke, but their reach extended far beyond the church walls. Not everyone entered those booths out of faith. Some did so out of fear. A baker whose son had begun asking dangerous questions. A widow whose tenant kept odd hours and rent by lamplight. A servant who overheard a guest fondly of Janhus. For them, confession was a place to unload suspicions. In some churches, records were secretly kept. Not official, not inked in red, but thin slivers of parchment slid into books or pinned behind altar drapes. Names, phrases, quiet transgressions. The clergy did not always share this information freely. Some guarded it like relics. Others used it carefully. A warning here, a whispered reminder there. And sometimes information flowed upward not to God, but to the palace. It wasn't unusual for a nobleman to quietly visit a favored priest, not for penance, but for updates. Has the tailor's son been attending mass? Did that merchant confess anything of interest? Has anyone spoken of the utriquist lately? The priest would nod or shake his head. Sometimes he'd say nothing, which was an answer all its own. There were rumors, never confirmed but widely believed, that some confessionals were modified. Not by the priests, but by city officials. A hollow wall. A pipe to carry sound. A hidden scribe on the other side. When confronted, the bishops denied it. The carpenters shrugged. The people just adjusted their tone. But this quiet system of surveillance came with a price. It changed the relationship between the people and their faith. For some, it made the church feel less like a sanctuary and more like a shadow. It blurred the line between the sacred and the state, between redemption and record-keeping. Those who grew wary found new ways to protect themselves. Some began to confess in riddles. A farmer might speak of his fields being tempted by wild ones, meaning his children had been approached by reformers. A teacher might say he wrote lessons no longer taught, hinting at hidden books or alternate texts. The priests understood or pretended to. Others turned to silence. They stopped confessing altogether. When questioned, they'd claim they had nothing to confess. No thoughts unclean, they'd say. No words misplaced. It was often a lie. But it was a polite one, wrapped in enough reverence to pass. There were also those who used the booth as a weapon, confessing false things to test the priest, to see what information made its way back to their neighbors. A kind of baiting, dangerous, but occasionally effective. One merchant confessed to sympathizing with Lutheran traders, only to hear the rumor repeated at market a week later. He changed churches. Among the most intriguing stories was that of Sister Rosalie, a nun stationed at a convent near the river. Though her duties were simple, her role unofficially expanded over time. People began coming to her with concerns too delicate for a priest. She listened, but never wrote, never repeated. Her tiny stone cell became a quieter confessional, free from gilded chairs or political sermons. Eventually, even certain priests began to send people her way. Speak to Rosalie, they'd say. She remembers better than God. And while all this unfolded behind closed doors, the confessional booth remained unmoved. Carved wood, heavy curtain. The same scent, the same shape, the same promise. It's said that during the Counter-Reformation, some priests were ordered to report any confession that suggested heretical thought. Not to punish, necessarily, but to monitor. These confessions weren't acted on immediately. They were catalogued. And like all secrets kept too long, they began to weigh heavily. One priest, aged and tired, eventually walked away from his booth and never returned. He left a note. Just one sentence. A shepherd cannot watch the flock while counting wolves. The booth he left behind still stands. Tourists walk past it every day. Most don't look twice. Some step inside for photos. But locals avoid it, not out of fear, out of habit. It still feels too full. And so, over time, the church had to reckon with what it had become in Prague, not just a place of faith, but of surveillance, subtle influence, and stored memory. Not all priests abused their position. Many served with deep integrity. But the damage done by a few left a scar across centuries. Today, modern confession still exists, but it is quieter, less formal, more private, and far less trusted. Because in Prague, the idea of privacy still comes with a pause. The people here remember too well how easily faith can become function, how easily comfort becomes control. Let us now step out of the shadows of incense and into a different kind of fire, a mystery that left no visible mark, but rattled the minds of its victims. A sickness of unknown origin that made its way through the city like a whisper turned scream, known as the Fire of St. Vitus. Chapter 11. The Fire of St. Vitus. The fire didn't burn wood, and it didn't leave behind ash. It moved silently, invisibly through streets and homes and minds. No smoke, no heat, no open flame. Yet it left people shaking, shouting, and running from their own shadows. They called it the Fire of St. Vitus, and in Prague it arrived like a fever dream no one could wake from. It began, as these things often do, with whispers. A girl in a new town was seen walking in circles near the market square, arms flailing, eyes wide but unseeing. Some thought she was drunk. Others, possessed. When her family took her home, she collapsed and shook uncontrollably through the night. By the next morning, 2 more cases were reported. One, a baker's apprentice who suddenly began humming a hymn he never knew, louder and louder until he collapsed. The other, a priest who screamed through a sermon, claiming the saints were melting. Panic in Prague had many historical precedents, wars, sieges, plagues, but this was different. There were no wounds to bind, no infections to treat. The afflicted looked normal. Until they didn't, they would freeze mid-step. Their hands would twitch. They'd weep without cause or burst into wild laughter that turned to screams. People called it dancing. That was the most polite name they could give it. And so it became known dancing mania, or, in local terms, the Fire of St. Vitus, a divine punishment, perhaps, or a plague of the soul, or something worse. In truth, no one knew. It was not unique to Prague. Records of similar afflictions stretched back across Europe, Strasbourg, Erfurt, Aichi. But in this city, under the weight of Reformation tensions and imperial pressure, the outbreak felt personal. It struck the city like a cracked bell-off pitch, unsettling and impossible to ignore. The afflicted came from all walks of life: nobles, merchants, peasants, friars. There seemed to be no pattern. Some danced until they collapsed. Others murmured in dead languages. A few stared into corners for hours, unmoving, as though waiting for something only they could see. One night, a group of 10 women were seen dancing barefoot on Charles Bridge. Witnesses said they moved in perfect unison, despite never having met. One by one, they dropped to the ground. None remembered what happened. Church officials declared it a spiritual illness. They blamed sin, of course, excess, heresy, undigested guilt. Prayers were offered, bells rung, exorcisms performed. The afflicted, when lucid, confessed to things they hadn't done, desperate for peace. Nothing helped. Physicians blamed bile, or imbalance of the humors. One theorized it was caused by the moon. Another, by mold on rye bread ergot, a fungus that mimicked madness. That theory, centuries later, would become popular among scholars. But at the time, it brought little comfort to those watching their neighbors writhe on the chapel floor. The city council did what councils always do. They panicked in private and postured in public. They banned gatherings, closed beer halls, ordered affected neighborhoods to remain indoors. No one obeyed. What good was a curfew when the danger was inside your own skin? Some turned to alchemy. They sought powders to purge the blood, metals to balance the mind. None worked. But it kept them occupied, kept their hands from trembling. One alchemist claimed to have brewed a cure using moonlight, crushed emeralds, and holy water. He charged 3 florins per vial. Most bought it. It tasted like ash. The symptoms remained. Meanwhile, the people watched each other closely. A twitch could be a yawn, or the start of something worse. A stumble on the stairs became suspicious. Laughter rang out in the streets and no one laughed back. Fear settled like frost. Saint Vitus, the namesake of a strange affliction, was a 4th century martyr. In life, he had been known for visions, for miracles, for healing the mad. And now, ironically, he had become associated with the very thing he was once said to cure. Some claimed to see his statue weeping. Others claimed he smiled. A small shrine was erected outside the cathedral gates. People left offerings, candles, coins, hair ribbons. A man left a full wheel of cheese and returned the next day to find it untouched. He claimed it meant the saint was angry. Others claimed it meant he was lactose intolerant. In Prague, even madness came with dry wit. As weeks passed, the fire spread, not just through people, but through stories. Everyone knew someone who had seen it or felt it coming. Nightmares increased. Dogs barked at empty doorways. Musicians reported strings snapping without cause. At its height, more than 200 people were believed to be afflicted. Some recovered. Others vanished. A few were locked away in churches, tied gently to pews, reciting psalms through bloody tongues. But then, as suddenly as it came, the fire died down. The streets grew quiet. The laughter returned to taverns, albeit warier. The shrines were dismantled. The city sighed. No explanation was ever agreed upon. No true cure ever found. It left behind no scars, only memory. The kind that lingers beneath the skin. The kind that makes you glance sideways when someone taps their foot too long. And though no new cases emerged, the fear remained. In Prague, people came to believe in a kind of second sight, a sense that madness might return. That under the wrong moon lit the wrong sermon, it could flare again. The embers never fully cooled. Even today, in the archives beneath the monastery, you can find notes from that time, drawings of afflicted faces, scribbled theories, a list of words that appeared most often in the ravings. Mirror, fire, name, again. No one knows what they meant. But the word again appears over 50 times. So now, with the fire dimming behind us, we turn toward one who refused to be burned by it, a monk with more courage than caution, who hid dangerous words in hollow books and crossed graveyards to deliver truth. He did not shake, or flinch, or scream. He simply walked forward into the danger. In the weeks after the fire of St. Vitus had seemingly passed, Prague did not return to normal so much as it settled into a quieter version of unease. Life resumed as it always does, with market stalls reopening, sermons resuming, and cobblers returning to their benches. But something remained in the air. It wasn't smoke, it wasn't disease. It was tension like the moment just before a storm, when even the birds grow quiet. The church remained the loudest voice as always. Their explanation for the dancing plague was spiritual. The fire, they insisted, was a consequence of collective moral rot, an infestation of sin. Priests spoke louder in their sermons now, their words more urgent. This is what happens when the soul is neglected, they warned. When prayer is replaced with pride. Of course, not everyone agreed. Prague scholars debated more furiously than ever. Some believed the episode proved the dangers of unchecked emotion and suggested that music itself might provoke hysteria. A city council member actually proposed banning certain rhythms, thought to be too hypnotic. The measure didn't pass, but musicians noted that the dancing tunes went out of style quickly after. Then there were the herbalists and midwives who whispered other theories behind closed doors. They spoke of herbs corrupted by mildew, of cursed water wells, of dreams passed through blood. One midwife claimed the affliction wasn't illness at all, but a kind of collective curse cast by someone wrong long ago. When asked who, she only said, someone forgotten. Among the people, explanations didn't matter as much as stories. Stories helped organize the fear. One of the most retold tales was of a butcher's son who began to speak perfect Latin overnight, despite never having learned it. For a week he quoted scripture, even some books not officially part of the Bible. Then, just as suddenly, he went silent. He's said to have lived another 60 years without speaking a single word again. There was also the story of the stonemason who was unaffected, but whose wife had been among the afflicted. Each night she would dream of burning, and each night he would wake to find her bedsheets twisted around her limbs. One evening he bound her gently before sleep to keep her safe, he said. She never woke again. Some believed he smothered her. Others believed something far stranger. He was never charged. But no one would hire him again, and his tools rusted slowly in the rain outside his home. And there was a tavern keeper in Malestrana who refused to serve any customer whose hands trembled, even slightly. One day he rejected a wealthy patron with a mild tremor, perhaps not. The man was insulted and left. The next week, city guards closed the tavern down for good, citing an expired tax document that no one had ever enforced before. The tavern keeper left town. Some say he moved to a village where no one had heard of the fire. Others say he vanished. In time, the church created a set of prayers specifically for protection against inner burning. They were recited quietly, especially by mothers over their children. Guard their feet from false dances, guard their minds from wild rhythms, guard their nights from borrowed dreams. It was a prayer meant not for spectacle, but for the silent kind of terror, the sort you never show on your face. And while the public fear dulled, the private one remained. Even the physicians, who had long dismissed the spiritual explanations, began checking pulses differently, slower, more cautious. A slight fever was no longer just a fever. A nervous twitch was something to watch. At the city's edge, near the old Jewish cemetery, a small group of scholars began recording the aftermath. They charted names, symptoms, recoveries, and eventual fates. But they also recorded something else, what the afflicted said, not in a scientific way, but as scribes of strangeness. One note reads, "Woman, age unknown, repeated the phrase. I remember the bells before they rang." Another reads, "Boy 13, flames of fire was music made visible." And another, "Merchants, said he saw the city from above, covered in frost, yet he felt heat. Could not explain." These were not the kinds of notes that made it into church records or official city chronicles. They were stored in a wooden chest wrapped in cloth, passed between hands for safekeeping. Generations later, the chest was rediscovered during renovations to a university archive. Its contents are now kept quietly in a museum vault, rarely displayed, often ignored, but never destroyed. The fire of St. Vitus came to be spoken of less and less. It was mentioned in jest, sometimes, or as a cautionary tale for children who laughed too loudly or danced too freely. But for many, the memory never softened into humor. Even centuries later, during times of upheaval, wars, famines, invasions, there were occasional reports of isolated symptoms. A girl who wept through the night, a soldier who danced in his sleep, a choir boy who hummed in tongues. Whether coincidence, inheritance, or imagination, no one could say. But the pattern was never forgotten. Today, if you walk the narrow streets near the Voltova River on a cold, silent night, you may hear faint sounds that don't belong to the present. A hush where no wind blows. A shuffling footstep where no one stands. It could be the echo of tourists. Or it could be something older, something that once moved through Prague like a fever, unseen, unstoppable. It was not a threat, not anymore. But it is not entirely gone either. It sits in the city's memory like a coal buried in snow. Not burning, just waiting. And now, let us follow one soul who did not fear flames or shadows or the silence that followed them. A monk without riches, title, or protection, but with a cause. His story was not one of madness, but of clarity. He walked through graveyards, across rooftops, between cloisters, carrying ideas the world had forbidden. Chapter 12. The monk who refused to stay silent. His name was Brother Andre. Not a name remembered in textbooks or carved into grand cathedrals. But in Prague, if you know where to listen beneath cloister arches. Behind cracked monastery walls, you'll still hear his name whispered like a thread in the wind. He was not famous, not canonized, not rich. He had no miracles to his name. What he had instead was an idea, and a habit of carrying dangerous texts tucked under his robe. Brother Andre belonged to a quiet order that made its home on the outer edge of the old town, a crumbling monastery, its bricks worn thin by frost and prayer, its garden overgrown with ivy and soft clumps of sage. The monks who lived there were not powerful. They were scribes, healers, keepers of minor relics, and stewards of silence. But Andre was not content to copy the past. He believed Prague's soul was being quietly buried beneath gold leaf and papal decrees. He translated snippets into even simpler Czech, adding notes of his own. He wrapped these tiny writings in oilcloth and hid them behind the statue of St. Wenceslas in the chapel vestibule. An investigation was opened. Andre's chambers were searched. They found only a few harmless letters, a copy of the Book of Psalms, some dried herbs. Nothing heretical. He believed truth should not be buried in Latin. It should be spoken plainly, passed quietly, read in kitchens and cellars and taverns. The trouble began, as it often does, with a book. Night after night, when the bell tolled midnight and the others slept, he crept through the monastery halls and down into the crypt. He simply believed people deserved to read words that hadn't been gilded, censored, or distorted. There, among the dust of long-dead abbots, he tucked the pages inside hollowed-out hymnals. He used beeswax to seal them. He had already moved them again, this time into a sealed niche behind the reliquary of St. Vitus himself. But they did find his journal, a thin, worn thing, hidden beneath his sleeping mat. Then, during the day, he'd walk into the city and leave one here, one there, a hymnal in a graveyard niche, another in the confessional, another tucked beneath the pews of an old chapel no longer in use, simply exiled. The church preferred not to make martyrs if it could avoid it. They claimed to be from the bishop's office, conducting a routine inspection. They were polite, smiling, cold, not angrily, not defiantly, just no. It arrived one winter morning, wrapped in cloth, carried by a nervous courier with no name. He said the monk wore no robe, carried no belongings, and smiled like someone who had already said everything that needed to be said. The monks were used to packages, parchments for illumination, scriptures in need of binding, but this one was different. But in the monastery where he once lived, there is still a hymnal with a hollowed-out space behind the last page. It smells faintly of wax, and inside, barely legible, are the words, "Truth is not a fire to burn. It is a candle to pass." A stonemason discovered a copy in his tool satchel. No one knew how it got there. A tavern singer found one under her bench and set the words to a quiet melody. Into the shadows between ideals and orders, a city where one wrong word could spill blood, where religion and empire clash not on battlefields, but on cobblestones under a sky that always seemed just a little too still. The ideas spread not loudly, not in crowds, but like smoke under a door. Its script was sharp, its ink fresh. It was in Czech, not Latin, and its message? Searing. It was a translation of Jan Hus's forbidden sermons, condemned as heresy. Banned by the church, dangerous, but brilliant. Andre read the text late into the night, the candlelight trembling as he turned each page. He felt something inside him shift, not like a revolution, more like a bell being rung softly for the first time. But he asked questions about the price of indulgences, about the Latin-only services, about the poor who stood outside the church doors with empty hands while bishops rode past in fine carriages. At first, his brothers indulged him. Every monk wrestled with doubt, they said. Every monk asked questions. It was natural. The next day, he hid the book beneath the floorboards of the scriptorium. He did not tell the abbot. From that point on, Andre began to change. He was still obedient, still quiet. But Andre didn't stop asking. And more troubling still, he started to write. He copied Huss's words by hand in his own quiet script. Eventually, others noticed. Brother Philip, a stern monk with eyes like cold stones, reported him to the abbot. But the suspicion lingered. Andre knew it was only a matter of time before they found the real writings, so he moved them. He wasn't trying to start a war. He wasn't trying to be a hero. And strangely, his writings began to travel. A merchant found one and gave it to his wife, who passed it to her sister. But the church, always watching, began to suspect. One evening, as the sky turned the color of wet slate, two officials in fine robes arrived at the monastery gates. They did not find Andre's copies. It did not contain heresy, but it contained doubt. And in Prague, during the height of the Counter-Reformation, doubt was often more dangerous than defiance. Andre was summoned before the council of abbots. They asked if he had written the words. He said yes. They asked if he would renounce them. He said no. He was removed from the order, quietly. No charges. No trial. For months, no one knew where he had gone. But then the pages began appearing again, this time in towns beyond Prague. Brno, Kutná Hora, Olomouc. Same script, same notes, same quiet flame. Years later, a baker in southern Bohemia claimed he had met Andre, and in a way he had. Today, scholars debate whether Andre was real or merely a symbol, a composite of many quiet rebels. And pass it he did. Let us now follow that candle into the streets of Prague once more. Brother Andre may have been banished from his cloister, but his words were not so easily exiled. In the years that followed his quiet departure, copies of his writings continued to turn up in unexpected places, stuffed between the pages of legal ledgers, sewn into the linings of coats, even scratched faintly into the underside of pews. Always unsigned, always humble, but unmistakably his. Some believed he had wandered into the countryside to live as a hermit. Others were convinced he had found refuge among Protestant sympathizers in secret gatherings outside the city. A few whispered that he had fled across the border into Saxony, where Czech rebels plotted their next moves, and books like his were printed openly, in broad daylight, without fear. But no one ever saw him again with certainty. Perhaps that, too, was by design. What Andre left behind was not revolution in the fiery sense. It was more like a soft erosion, a gentle, persistent questioning of the order that claimed to speak for heaven. His pamphlets often began not with declarations, but with questions. Why does a beggar kneel beside gold? Or, what good is a sermon if the hungry cannot eat it? Questions that slipped under a man's skin and stayed there. Within Prague, his legacy took root in quiet corners. Tailors would sometimes hum melodies adapted from his texts as they worked their thread. A glass blower in Nov Mesto etched short verses into the stems of goblets, visible only when drained. A baker reportedly gave his loaves names like Mercy and Doubt. No one said Andre's name aloud, not in public. But many lived with his words near their hearts. Still, Prague was not a city that forgave quietly. The church did not forget. And while they could not find Andre, they could trace his influence. Several citizens were arrested, not for owning the texts, but for spreading them. One school teacher was taken for interrogation after students were caught reciting a morning prayer that wasn't part of the official liturgy. She claimed she found it scratched onto the underside of a park bench. Whether that was true or not, she lost her position and never taught again. A candle maker was accused of embedding tiny slivers of parchment fragments of Andre's texts into candles sold to noble households. Upon melting, the wax revealed sentences that glowed briefly before vanishing into smoke. He denied it, of course. But the rumor persisted, and his candles became strangely popular among certain circles. Even the confessional booths, those echo chambers of whispered sins, weren't safe from his influence. One priest claimed a young woman confessed to reading a banned book that described Christ not as a king, but as a companion to the poor. It made me less afraid, she told him. Is that a sin? The priest, to his credit, did not report her. He simply nodded and said, fear is not a virtue. In time, the church shifted its strategy. Instead of hunting words, it tried to outshine them. More grand sermons were commissioned. Processions became more elaborate. Churches gleamed brighter with gold. They tried to make holiness feel expensive. But some noticed that more didn't always mean better, and more people quietly, carefully began to seek simpler paths. Meanwhile, Those who had known Andre in the monastery aged and passed on. Brother Philip, the one who had first reported him, was said to have become increasingly withdrawn. In his final years, he refused to enter the chapel and insisted on eating alone. A novice once asked him why he never sang during morning prayer. He reportedly replied, "I once mistook silence for danger. I no longer trust my own voice." When he died, among his few possessions was found a single, folded scrap of parchment bearing a line in Andre's handwriting. Some chains are made of gold. Others are made of fear. Today, few tourists hear about Brother Andre. His name is not carved into any wall, nor is there a statue in his honor. But if you visit certain churches in Prague, especially the smaller ones, the forgotten ones, you may find little signs. A psalm written slightly differently, a candle holder shaped like a book, an inscription under the pew that reads, "Truth sits among the dust." In a museum cellar not open to the public, there's a hymnal once belonging to the old monastery. It looks ordinary. Leather binding, worn spine, brittle pages. But near the back, in faint brown ink, is a note that reads, "The monk who walks is louder than the priest who shouts." Below it, a symbol, not a signature, just a small wax seal in the shape of that flame, some say, was the last thing Andre left behind. Not to burn, but to guide. And so the candle passes once more, this time, not into the hands of rebels or scholars, but into the bloodied cobblestones of the city itself. For Prague, for all its silent saints and hidden texts, has always had a violent undercurrent. Beneath the sermons and sculptures is a city built on conflict, a city where faith could not protect you from the mob, a city where one accusation could ignite a riot. Let us now walk into the smoke and ash of that truth, into the boiling moment where doctrine met rage, and where the streets themselves turned red with conviction. Chapter 30. Bohemian Blood on the Cobblestones. Segment 1. There are places in Prague where the stone seems darker, not from shadow, but from memory. Near the Church of Our Lady before 10, beneath the arches of the Old Town Square, and in the alleys that curve behind the Charles Bridge, the stones carry more than just footsteps. Locals will tell you they carry echoes of chants, of boots, of blood. In the early 17th century, Prague was no longer merely a city of scholars and saints. It was a pressure cooker of politics and faith, loyalty and rebellion. The Protestant-Catholic divide had hardened. The Habsburg crown sat heavier than ever on the city's neck, and beneath the polished sermons and legal pronouncements, there boiled something raw and restless. Dissent was not whispered anymore. It was shouted, and sometimes it exploded. One cold morning in March, just after the snow had begun to rot into slush, the bells of St. Nicholas rang out strangely early, not for Mass, not for morning, but for warning. Mob had gathered near the new town hall. It had started with a dispute, a Catholic tax official accused of embezzlement, of withholding grain shipments meant for Protestant families during the winter. A crowd assembled to demand answers. He refused to give any. The crowd didn't like that. What happened next was never officially documented in detail, though many described it in hushed tones. A push, a scream, then a stone, then 5. The tax official tried to retreat inside the hall, but never made it. The door was barricaded from the outside. His body was later found beneath a pile of firewood. What shocked the council most wasn't the death itself, but how quickly the crowd dispersed afterward, silent, organized, as if rehearsed. It was not the first time blood had touched Prague's cobblestones, but it was a signal. The city, once a jewel of theological discourse and scholarly restraint, had changed. The tension had reached skin level. In the months that followed, more violence bloomed. Protestant students clashed with Jesuit priests in the university district. Pamphlets appeared overnight, accusing certain bishops of corruption. The statues of saints were defaced, not shattered, just turned gently to face the wall, as if in protest. One spring evening, a fight broke out in the beer hall near the Powder Tower It started with an argument over scripture and ended with 2 men dead and a third missing an eye. The barman scrubbed the floor in silence, then quietly raised the price of ale. Say only, if you're going to spill it, it should cost more. Not all violence was spontaneous. Some was planned. In a house near the Jewish quarter, a group of radicals met each week to discuss a potential uprising. They were craftsmen, minor clerks, and one woman who had once been a nun. They referred to themselves only as the Hands. Their symbol was a bleeding palm. They believed the city's future could only be rewritten in blood. They were never caught, but they left messages. One scratched into a wooden beam at a chapel. God hears prayers. Kings hear screams. Then there were the riots following the sermon of Father Cover, a Jesuit priest known for his firebrand rhetoric. One Sunday he denounced Protestant books as the mildew of the soul and called for them to be burned in the square. The very next night, his quarters were torched. He survived, barely. The fire was blamed on chimney soot, but no one believed that. Not even the fire marshal, who reportedly found a bundle of dried flowers arranged in the shape of a cross at the seam, lavender and rue. A warning? As the unrest built, the city guards grew more aggressive. Curfews were enforced. Markets were watched. Anyone caught carrying more than one book without proof of purchase was interrogated. One merchant's son was arrested for possessing a translated version of the Psalms. His father paid a heavy bribe to have him released, only to find him mute and shaking upon his return. He never spoke again. Even the children were drawn into it. In one school, a group of students began carving symbols into their desks' flames. Broken crowns, and once a crude depiction of St. Wenceslas with his mouth sewn shut. The schoolmaster, a loyal Catholic, tried to punish them, but the children refused to say who had started it. Eventually, the entire class was disbanded. One child later wrote, "We learned more in silence than we ever did from his chalk." The cobblestones of Prague soaked up all of it. They did not choose sides. They simply bore witness. By midsummer, the city was ripe for something larger, something final. The nobles could feel it. So could the clergy. A storm was coming, not from the sky, but from beneath. And then it happened. In the heat of July, during the feast of St. James, a procession wound its way through the streets, priests in gold, swinging censers, followed by bishops and nobles. They passed the market square just as a group of beggars arrived, dragging carts of bones from the plague pits, hoping to earn coin for burial. The nobles recoiled. One bishop ordered the beggars to be whipped for desecrating sacred space. The beggars refused to move. A guard struck first. The crowd exploded. Stones flew, then sticks, then knives. And as the sun beat down on the holy day, the sacred and the profane collided in one great heaving mass. People screamed the names of saints as they struck each other. One priest was trampled beneath a cart. A noble's robes caught fire from a toppled censer. Children climbed statues to watch. When it ended, the square was littered with bodies, some dead, some unconscious, some just dazed. The church claimed it as a desecration. The Protestants called it judgment. The people just called it Tuesday. No one won. The stones remained stained. For days, the city stank of sweat, smoke, and something older, something like fear. Let us now follow that sense a little further. Not into violence, but into silence. Into the moment after the scream, where power begins to crack not from without, but from within. A city waking from its fever dream, still beautiful, still breathing, but frayed, exhausted, crumbling under its own contradictions. After the Feast of St. James turned into a blood-soaked memory, Prague did not return to peace. It merely held its breath. The violence had been sudden, but the aftermath was drawn out, as if the city itself wasn't sure what it had just done. Shopkeepers reopened with fewer smiles. Monks walked faster between chapels, and beggars were no longer ignored. They were feared. No one wanted to speak too loudly. No one wanted to be the next reason the bells rang. The King's Council issued proclamations. New guards were stationed at city gates. A curfew was declared, no one in the streets after sunset unless carrying a church-issued token or a noble seal. Those without were escorted home, sometimes gently, sometimes not. In the taverns there was less laughter and more listening. Men leaned closer to one another, speaking in slow, cautious tones. One wrong joke, one half-true rumor, could turn into a summons, or worse, silence. Not the kind that comes from peace, but the kind that follows a closed door and heavy boots outside your window. Among the educated, the violence bred a different fear. University professors began rewriting old sermons to avoid any appearance of partisanship. Lectures became duller, safer, and far less attended. One historian, known for his passionate retellings of Bohemian revolts, suddenly shifted focus to the history of farming tools. "It is better," he reportedly said, "to be boring than buried." The churches, meanwhile, leaned harder into spectacle. Masses became longer, more incense, more pageantry, more reminders that order, not truth, was the foundation of faith. In one chapel, a bishop introduced a ritual washing of the cathedral steps every morning. A symbolic cleansing meant to wash away the sins of the mob. It did not work. One morning, someone poured pig's blood over the freshly scrubbed stone. No one was ever caught. In the Jewish quarter, the violence was not new. It was simply closer now. The ghetto gates were closed earlier. Trade slowed. One young boy was beaten in the street for speaking Hebrew too loudly. His father petitioned for justice and was told, flatly, "Now is not the time for provocations." The man never petitioned again, but even amid the fear, resistance took root. It always does. In a bakery near the Voltova, a woman began carving small crosses into her loaves. Not the traditional Catholic cross, but a crooked, slanted one used by the early Protestants. Customers noticed. Some bought more. Others stopped coming. She kept baking. A blacksmith painted a mural on the inside of his shop, door visible only when closed. It showed a lion chained to a pulpit surrounded by sheep in noble robes. He claimed it was a joke. No one laughed. But they did remember it. There were more pamphlets. Handwritten, smudged, barely legible. But they multiplied. Some were lines of poetry. Some were rewritten prayers. One simply read, "They can't burn us all." They appeared in market baskets, under pews, inside empty wine bottles left near the square. The authorities dismissed them as the work of cowards and drunks. But the truth was they had no idea who wrote them. Then came the processions. Every month, the King's Court sponsored public parades meant to showcase loyalty to the Habsburgs and the Catholic faith. Marching clergy, noble families, banners, relics. A performance of power. But as these parades became more frequent, the crowds became thinner. People stood at windows instead of lining the streets. They clapped less. The city was not rebelling. It was withdrawing. On the 10th procession, someone released hundreds of crickets into the crowd. No one was harmed. But the screeching drowned out the priests. It was strange, unsettling, and somehow effective. The next parade was smaller. And then the executions. The government needed to reassert control. So they found scapegoats. 8 men and 1 woman, all accused of inciting riots, spreading heresy, or undermining royal authority. The evidence was thin, but that didn't matter. The trials were fast. The gallows were raised in the old town square. On the morning of the executions, the air was still. The city held its breath again. Each prisoner was marched barefoot, their heads shaved. They were not allowed to speak, not to the crowd, not even to their families. As the nooses were tightened, one man managed to hum a tune, a quiet lullaby from the southern hills. He was silenced before the second note. No one cheered, no one jeered. It was quiet except for the crows circling above. Afterward, the gallows remained standing for 3 days. A warning, but warnings only work on those still afraid. In the months that followed, a subtle defiance grew. Street vendors began using code names for books. The Bible became the heavy apple. Huss's sermons were warm shoes. A handwritten list circulated detailing which corners of the city were safest for whispered prayers, which guards could be bribed, which gates to use if you needed to disappear. One night, beneath a half-moon sky, someone placed a crown of thorns on the statue of St. John of Nepomuk on the Charles Bridge. The thorns were real. So were the drops of blood found below it? Whether from the thorns or something else, no one could say, and the cobblestones. They remained, watching, listening, remembering. If you walk those streets today, it's easy to imagine nothing ever happened. Prague is clean now, right? Alive with tourists and music and light. But if you walk slowly and if the evening fog rolls just right, you may feel that slight shift in the air, that tug in your chest, that echo of footsteps not quite your own. It's not ghosts. Not exactly. It's the memory of a city that once chose silence, then shouted, then bled. Now, as dawn rises beyond the eastern rooftops, we enter the final chapter. A city once burning, now cooling. Its emperors fading, its revolts buried, its beauty undeniable and exhausting. Prague, no longer a battlefield, but a relic of everything it survived. The empire's bones creak, the crown slips, and the streets hum with the final sighs of a century gasping for quiet. Chapter 14, Dawn in a Dying Empire, Segment 1. By the turn of the 17th century's final years, Prague had become something strange, not broken, not defeated, just weary. The city still stood tall beneath its spires and domes. The Vltava still flowed gently beneath the bridges. From a distance, the skyline shimmered with majesty. But up close, the stonework was beginning to flake. Beneath the gold leaf, cracks were spidering through the plaster. The empire still claimed greatness, but its grip was loosening. The Habsburgs, once so certain of their divine mandate, now ruled more through inertia than inspiration. Their courts were still richly dressed, still perfumed with incense and diplomacy, but the eyes of their servants told a different story. No one bowed quite as deeply. No one lingered quite as long. Even the palace halls, once alive with whispered intrigue, had grown quieter. Dust collected in corners no one swept, paintings darkened, tapestries sagged. The Holy Roman Emperor Rudolph II, once the jewel of imperial eccentricity, had retreated into near-total seclusion by now. His obsession with alchemy, astrology, and hidden truths had long since eclipsed his interest in matters of governance. He wandered his chambers at odd hours, often barefoot, speaking to statues or scribbling equations in the margins of religious texts. His court whispered about demons and genius, divine insight and madness, but rarely out loud. Few were brave enough to disturb him. Fewer still dared to contradict him. Behind his back, they called him the Emperor of Shadows. And while he fiddled with stars and vials, the empire began to come undone. In the city below, the old fires of rebellion had cooled, but not disappeared. The streets still carried tension like a lingering scent. Protestants watched the churches grow richer and gritted their teeth. Catholics grew suspicious of every quiet conversation. The common people, those too poor for politics, simply kept their heads down and prayed not to be noticed. They had seen what happened to those who stood too tall. The markets, once buzzing with trade, had slowed. Merchants complained of fewer travelers, more taxes, and dishonest coinage. One seller of tapestries gave up entirely and turned his stall into a soup stand, claiming that at least people still need to eat, even if they no longer care for beauty. Another merchant, once famed for importing rare books, burned half his stock during a surprise inspection. The next day, he offered only blank parchment. Safer, he said with a shrug, and more profitable too. Even the beggars had changed. Fewer children begged now, many had been orphaned or sent away to the countryside. The adults left behind worked in pairs, trading corners, watching the guards, signaling to each other in quiet gestures honed by years of survival. They did not plead as they once did. They stared silent and still. And people gave not from pity, but from fear of being noticed, of being followed, of being mistaken for someone with too much or too little. In the monasteries, hymns still echoed through cold stone, but fewer voices joined in. Many monks had left, quietly, choosing country parishes over city politics. Some had disappeared entirely. A few were rumored to have joined hidden Protestant sects. One abbey near the edge of Prague was found completely empty one morning. No note, no signs of struggle. Just a cold meal left on a wooden table, and candles still flickering beside the altar. The Jewish quarter remained walled off, but not forgotten. It was both feared and envied. Feared for its myths, for its golem stories, for the whispers of arcane protection, envied for its resilience. While the Christian city teetered on theological fault lines, the quarter endured, trading, praying, waiting, not untouched by hardship, but shaped by it, and always watching. As Prague drifted into this strange twilight half awake, half dreaming rumors began to swell. Some said the emperor would abdicate. Others whispered that the city itself had been cursed, that the defenestration of envoys years ago had opened a spiritual wound that could not be healed. There was talk of the sleeping lion, a symbol for the Czech people lying dormant beneath foreign crowns, waiting for their hour to roar. More and more people spoke in symbols. Straight talk had grown too dangerous. Even the city's artists had grown somber. One muralist began painting angels with blindfolds. Another sculpted saints with mouths sealed by iron clasps. A poet was imprisoned for writing a sonnet about a cracked chalice. His final line read, "Some vessels spill not from sin, but from silence." But it wasn't all bleak. In the quiet, something else stirred too, something fragile and human. Families found solace in gardens, growing onions and herbs where roses once bloomed. Teachers returned to abandoned rooms, teaching children beneath broken roofs. A carpenter, once employed building gallows, turned his skill to making cradles. He carved each one with a small flame at its base. For light, he told buyers. Even when it's not safe to use a candle. And then came the dawn, soft, silver, reluctant. Each morning, Prague stirred to a new day, not with triumph, but with endurance. Women swept doorsteps. Boys chased rats from cellars. Priests lit incense with shaking hands. And in the cold, pale light, the city breathed in again, not deeply, but enough. This was no longer the Prague of proud reformers or roaring uprisings. It was a different city now, humbled, hardened, and strangely more honest. The masks had slipped. The gold had dulled. But the people remained, and that perhaps is the final truth of an empire. It does not end with a trumpet or a sword. It ends with sighs, with shutters being latched, with ink drying on edicts that no one reads. It ends when it no longer look up in wonder, but look down in quiet resignation, or perhaps with resolve. Let us step now into the very heart of this dusk. The empire not as it was meant to be, but as it actually stood. Not a beacon, but a burden. Not a crown, but a weight. One last breath before the night fully falls. As the 17th century came to its weary conclusion, Prague stood like an aging actor on a crumbling stage, still dressed in royal costume, still speaking in Latin and courtly phrases, but unsure who, if anyone, remained in the audience. The city, long the jewel of Bohemia, had not been conquered by fire or siege. Its wounds were slower, internal, more subtle. Its greatest enemy had turned out not to be the invading armies or religious rivals, but time itself. The streets of Prague did not fall silent all at once. They faded gradually, like a dream retreating with the dawn. One by one, the great minds of the city vanished. Some died, some fled, and others simply stopped speaking. A mathematician who once advised the emperor took a job carving numbers into tombstones. A painter who had captured the city's noble families and their finest silks now worked on commissions from wealthy merchants in Vienna, painting fruit bowls and sleeping dogs. He was not bitter. He simply said even fruit rots slower than kingdoms. The palace became quieter too. The great halls, once echoing with debates, concerts, and footsteps on polished floors, filled with stillness. Guards still stood at their posts. Scribes still dipped their quills, but they moved more slowly. No new laws were passed. No grand festivals were planned. Even the court jester, once known for jokes so sharp they made bishops blush, now sat by the fire, feeding crumbs to a lame pigeon. Emperor Rudolph's death in 1612 marked the end of something, but no one knew quite what. His funeral procession was as lavish as expected, but curiously sparse. Those who walked behind the coffin did so without tears. A few bowed their heads. Most simply walked, silently, as if marking not the loss of a man, but the fading of an era. They buried him with a copy of his favorite alchemical manuscript, a worn book of stars and metals. Some claimed it was blank, filled with nothing but hope and obsession. Others said its ink could only be seen by candlelight at midnight, and even then, only by those who had lost everything. His successor, Matthias, was more practical, but lacked Rudolph's strange charisma. He reorganized. He placated. He tried for a while to make things neat again. But Prague had grown tired of neatness. The people no longer believed that empires could be fixed with titles or treaties. They had learned too much, seen too much, buried too many. In the outer districts, peasants began to refer to the city not by name, but as the stone mouth. They said it swallowed prayers and spat out silence. They said it no longer dreamed. And yet, somehow, life continued. It always does. There were births, of course. Laughter, sometimes. A girl was born in Malistrana whose mother had survived both plague, and they named her Nadje, Hope. She grew up learning 3 languages, but never spoke of God unless asked. Her lullabies were wordless hums. Her favorite sound was the creak of the bakery door, which she said meant people were still hungry, still living. A boy was born in the Jewish quarter who would later grow up to copy the entire Torah by hand. Not once, but 3 times. He said he did it not out of piety, but because he liked the rhythm of the letters. When asked what he thought of Prague, he replied, "It's a city that remembers too well and forgets too easily." In a candlelit room near Hrodkany, a former nun opened a school for girls. She taught them arithmetic, how to read poetry, how to mend broken lace. She told them that silence could be sacred, but sometimes it was just fear wearing a robe. She hung no crucifix in her classroom, only a mirror and a map. Know where you are, she told her students, and who you are. Elsewhere, the music shifted. Fewer trumpets, more strings. Lutes and viols, soft and melancholic. Composers began writing pieces with no words, as if even lyrics had become too political. One piece, titled Lament for a City That Sleeps with Eyes Open, became popular in drawing rooms across Europe. Its composer remained anonymous, and in the cafes, new faces arrived, traders, scribes from distant places. They spoke of conflicts elsewhere, of tensions rising in other corners of the continent. The world was tilting again. You could feel it in the way people held their mugs a little tighter, or how they looked over their shoulders before speaking. The Reformation had not ended. It had merely paused. Prague would soon find itself at the heart of war once more. The 30 Years' War loomed like a storm just beyond the hills. Its causes were many, its horrors too vast for bedtime stories. But even then, even on the eve of catastrophe, the city still clung to its strange beauty. As winter returned, snow dusted the roofs like powdered sugar. The Vltava froze near the edges. Children skated using bones tied to their boots. A baker sold loaves shaped like suns. A priest sang carols in German and Czech. A woman lit a lantern every night and placed it on her windowsill, just in case someone was lost. Or returning, the empire, for all its pomp and ceremony, was not immortal. Its foundations had been laid in blood, ambition, and parchment. But time is a patient thief. It takes what swords and plagues cannot, and when it is done, all that's left is stone and story. And in Prague, the stories linger in the curve of an alleyway, in the chipped face of a saint, in the pattern of tiles that don't quite match. 1,000 fragments of lives once lived. Beggars, kings, martyrs, liars, each whispering to the cobblestones, "I was here. I mattered." So now, as we reach the end of our walk through this tired, golden city, take a breath, a real one. Let it fill your chest. Let the weight of their histories settle lightly on your shoulders, not to burden, but to remind. That sleep, too, is a kind of empire, that dreams rise from ashes, and that even in the coldest corners of time, someone always leaves a lantern lit. Soon, we will rest. But first, let us close our eyes and step gently into the quiet. And now, as the lamps fade low and the city rests beneath a gentle shroud of sleep, we come to the end of our quiet journey through Reformation-Era Prague. What began in the cold shadow of cathedral doors has brought us through alleys of protest, rooms filled with whispers, halls haunted by power, and streets soaked in truths that too many tried to bury. They saw more than the nobles ever did. They listened when others spoke too loudly. They remembered when others tried to forget. Through frostbitten fingers and empty bellies, they carried stories, some real, some imagined, but all deeply felt. To wake each morning, unsure whether one's prayers are safe to whisper, whether your neighbors still believe in the same God or any at all, whether the bread you earn today will be burned tomorrow as a symbol of heresy. They were, in their own way, archivists of the soul of Prague, not as it was imagined in royal decrees or papal bulls, but in the hands of its people, those who brewed beer with trembling hands, who wrote verses in candlelight, who carried water through muddy alleys. But they are the thread, the unbreakable seam that held the city together while kings plotted and priests shouted. They made Prague not only survivable, but living. The hush of slippered feet over cracked floorboards, the creak of a wooden gate in the wind, the soft breath of someone exhaling after holding it in too long, who resisted not with weapons, but with memory, who passed down lullabies instead of laws, who found ways, always, to begin again. This was not a city of saints, nor one of monsters. It was something far more complicated. It was human. You enter unsure, but within its walls you are allowed to forget, to drift, to remember only what your body needs to keep. And when you wake, the past is there, not to frighten you, but to remind you that you made it through. Past the sermons of Jan Hus, who burned not just at the stake, but into the minds of generations, through wars sparked by windows and fueled by fear. Into midnight tales of golems and angels, of alchemists who believed the world could be melted down and reforged in gold. We wandered into ghettos that were both prisons and sanctuaries, fears you cannot name, strengths you forgot you had. Let them rest now. The city is quiet. The streets are swept. The guards are gone, danced briefly beneath chandeliers in rooms that reeked of perfume and pretense. And we sat with the cobblestones as they bore the weight of quiet feet, desperate riots, and the echo of a falling empire. Not to erase what you've learned, but to soften it. Let the questions drift. Let the weight lighten. The empire has faded. The cobblestones are cool. The city sleeps, and soon so shall you. The beggars of Prague were not simply figures hunched beneath cloaks, rattling cups at passing boots. They were the overlooked witnesses of an empire unraveling. We walked beside them. What does it mean truly to live in a city caught between fading faiths and rising fires? It meant living small, carefully, without guarantee. But it also meant resilience. Because despite the fear, the cold, the silences forced and chosen, Prague endured. History rarely remembers these people by name. They leave behind no marble busts, no portraits, no coat of arms. And in the gentle dark, they still walk. You can feel them if you close your eyes and listen carefully. Sleep, too, is a kind of Prague. It has its gates, its alleys, its high towers and hidden corners. Perhaps, like the beggars of Prague, you carry stories that have never been written. Only the stars keep watch now. They, too, have seen centuries pass, and still they shine. So allow yourself to let go. You have walked far. You have listened well. Now the gates are open. The lantern is lit. The bed is warm. Good night, traveler. Sleep deeply. Sleep well. Thank you for drifting through history with us. If you enjoyed this quiet journey into the past, gently tap subscribe and let the drowsy historian be your guide whenever sleep feels far away. Until next time, rest well, dream deeper, and remember, history is never in a hurry.